Welcome members of the public gallery. Nice to see some faces in here this evening. I'd like to start by declaring the meeting open at 6 p.m. and acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay our respects to elders past and present. As you may observe, we are having a hybrid meeting this evening. So we have council members in attendance via Zoom, as well as Councillor Warner and Ipolo in the chamber this evening. And we do have some members of the public gallery in person today, as well as having received some questions on notice. So in terms of apologies and members of leave of absence, and just checking that we do have all council members in attendance. I can't see Councillor Wallace. Oh, there you are. Hello, Councillor Wallace. Yes, we're all accounted for. So no apologies this evening. So that takes us straight to public question time and receiving of public statements. Welcome again. This is your time to please come forward and address council. We just ask that you state your name, the suburb in which you reside, and the item that you're speaking on this evening, and we do allow 3 minutes. So please come forward.
Good evening. My name's Johnine Lambourne. I'm principal at Arramore Catholic Primary School, and I'm here to speak about the proposed land sale of Lot 26 Brentham Street. It's difficult for the school community to support this plan, particularly as the school would be losing a well-utilised area that means a lot to our community. There appears to be questions and concerns left for the community to ponder. Council appears to have no clearly identified plans for the proceeds of the sale, except when land becomes available on the west side of Brady Street. Would Council reconsider the Brentham Street frontage for sale without the play area? The community understands that the Council knows how precious the play area of the proposed land is to the students who use it daily and to families who regularly gather there for school play and catch up. We ask if Council votes to sell the land process includes a guarantee that the land will be committed for further local community, social and recreational benefit. A guarantee that there will be a balance between the business needs of the council and those of the local community, and these needs are clearly communicated. In the event, and we hope not, that the land is not redeveloped for a fabulous play, social and recreational community space, it is to be sold privately. We ask that we are advised in a timely manner and we are able to consult with the intended purchaser on purpose. In the event, and we hope not, that the land is not redeveloped for a fabulous play, social and recreational community space, and the land isn't to be sold to an interested private party, we ask that the council proactively approach other public benevolent charities, community groups to work collaboratively on a future use for the land that will be beneficial to the local community. In the event, and we hope not, that the land is not redeveloped for a fabulous play, social and recreational community space, nor sold privately, we ask for consultation prior to any decision to publicly sell the land. As you understand, the community is not in favour of the land being redeveloped other than a magnificent play and social recreational community space established for the good of the local community. We ask can council commit to not selling for the purpose of housing development, as this is not in our understanding of the council brief currently. In regard to the proposal to develop the development of Wiley Place to be refurbished with a play community space, the school community would be most pleased for this, with significant redesign and landscaping of the current plants and foliage for clear line of sight from the road, footpath and general surrounds. The intended play space to be moved closer towards the school along Bennelong Reserve for quick access and to deter loiterers, voyeurs and opportunists, as well as easy access for staff and students. Close access for it is essential for safety and in the event of emergency. To include the schools as experts in child protection measures in the design and landscaping of the area, and to consult with staff and students in the structure and purpose of the play equipment to meet specific physical strength, development and interests of the students. In conclusion, it is difficult for the community to understand the current purpose of the land sale with no real purpose suggested for the proceeds, except for future play green spaces when that becomes available. The school community wishes to continue the dialogue with the council for the best possible outcome for the school and local residents. At the moment, we observe Peter is being robbed to pay Paul, except Paul doesn't really know his purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Next speaker, please.
My name is Wayne Bayliss. I live at 3 Daphne Street, North Perth, and I wish to speak on the Hyde Park issue again. I'm still very concerned that the council is not listening to the ratepayers. It has gone beyond the issue of the food trucks, in my opinion. I think there's been a lot of miscommunication and a lot of anger, actually on both sides really, that the council is not listening to what the petitioners in the petition that was presented to this council actually said. I, for one, I've only bought 2 cups of coffee from that caravan, even though I go to Hyde Park every day for my walk and do the dogs. It's beyond that. It's beyond the caravans, in my opinion, that the council is not listening, that we don't want to change. And also, I'm really worried that the council is entering into a commercial arrangement. Now, I have made a complaint about this to the ACCC, and I'm waiting on an opinion. I think the council should delay moving ahead with this proposal and investigate whether they are contravening the anti-competition and the council being involved in the commercial activity. I really think that's a serious issue that the council needs to look at. Otherwise, it's going to come back and bite you, for sure. My other main point is that why is the council ignoring that petition? We elected the council to represent us. Surely you take into account what we say or what we ask. But I was at this last meeting and it was like I was a ghost sitting in the back of the room. I just don't understand the reasoning why you are entering into this arrangement. What happens if you tender out this cafe and you get started and there's very minor profit to the council, very minor when you do the figures. What happens if it goes broken one year? You lose the cafe and you lose the food trucks. Are you going to let the food trucks come back in if the cafe goes broke? How will the council recoup the money spent on the refurbishment of that operation? The crux of the question here is, should the council be involved in a commercial activity at all? If I was a commercial operator, I would love what you're offering to be offered to me. It'd be like a gold mine. So please reconsider what you are doing. You know, 2 things here. You're upsetting the community and one, you're entering into a commercial operation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Next speaker, please.
Good evening, councillors, Mayor David McLennan. My name is Islam Bouyaya. I'm the owner and operator of the Hyde Park food truck in What the Flip in Hyde Park. Councillors, just would like to actually point out to the gentleman, Mr. Wayne just said before, it is true that this matter has become a lot bigger than me trying to save my business or about the food trucks in general within the city of Vincent. It really has come out as a disengagement from the community and families and apathy that is kind of marking the time in this office of this administration. And as a future ratepayer, and a future citizen in Australia, I found it sad that we are going down that path for something that the people want. So I can understand going through all the agendas that since 2009, a tea room idea was exploited in Hyde Park and pushed in 2013. Mayor Cole in numerous radio and TV station said about Dome Cafe and different tenders came. It was not the idea of what the council wanted. But now we have to try to focus on what the people are here wanting now. We have created a trade, we have created a lifestyle in this Hyde Park, which is seen as a sanctuary for many people. And now we are facing to lose the hard work of small business operators, which are also locals, against a brick and mortar business that many people, and the majority obviously, based on the consultations that we have been going through, if we read them properly, as Dr. MacArthur said, that the majority does not actually want, especially using ratepayers' money. And that's one thing that I pointed out on the 16th of February council meeting, on the 11th of May council meeting, on the 18th of May council meeting. In all of my statements, I always said that it does not feel right that we offer a full exclusivity to a business, a private operator within a private land. That said, if the market really wanted that kiosk, well, we should let them trade with the food trucks. I do understand that a few residents feel like it is like over-commercializing the park, which is completely understandable. My point in that park, as I mentioned on the 18th of May speech, I never tried to commercialize Hyde Park, always kept it on a low key. As you can see, I am very capable of commercializing any things that I feel is unfair and that I wish to fight for. But today, we have to look at it with common sense, with reason, with logic. We're about to spend close to $250,000 within a Hyde Park West, within the budget, I believe $220,000. Well, that budget could be used, as I said, on the 18th of May, once again, to better park, better light, better safety.
Islam,
And
that's
that's
3
all I
minutes.
have to say.
Thank you very much.
Mayor. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Next speaker, please. Are there any further speakers this evening? Okay, I'll close public question time, and just noting that we have received some written questions and they have been circulated.
Sorry, ma'am. We have received questions from David Collins of Leederville, Dudley Meyer of Highgate, and a range of statements in respect to the Hyde Park kiosk.
Okay, thank you. CEO, did you want to comment in relation to any of the issues around the commerciality?
Through your Echo, Mr. Bayliss did ask about whether a local government could engage in a commercial activity. Just to clarify, a local government and the City of Vincent owns a large number of properties and pieces of land, and it is well within council's prerogative to lease out those properties to potential tenants. In this case, this is a commercial lease to a commercial operator. And just to be crystal clear, the commercial activity, the trading, will be undertaken by the lessee, not by the City of Vincent. So there is no, the City of Vincent is not trading. The trading activity is by the proponent, who will bear 100% of the commercial risks for that trading operation.
Thank you, CEO. Possibly also worth mentioning that we, as a City of Vincent, do run businesses such as Beatty Park Leisure Centre, and Beatty Park Leisure Centre also has a cafe which is leased on similar terms. So we're closing public question time and moving on to applications for leave of absence. Are there any applications, council members? Councillor Loden. Oh, yeah.
I thought I put one in. Is that right, CEO?
Through your Mayor Cole, yes, on page 7 of the agenda, applications for leave of absence, Councillor Loden has requested a leave of absence from 8 to 23 April 2022.
Thank you, CEO. Can I please have a mover and seconder to approve the request for leave? Moved by Councillor Castle, seconded by Councillor Ivoplo. All those in favour? I declare that carried. Thank you.
May I put in a late request for absence? I was going to send it in, but there's another council meeting before the absence, but I might as well do it now since we're on the topic.
Go ahead.
Just requesting a leave of absence from the 9th to the 24th of April for personal reasons.
Thank you, Councillor Castle. Is everybody clear? 9th to the 24th of April. Wendy, did you catch that? Yep, thank you. Okay, can I have a mover and seconder to approve the leave? Moved by Councillor Hallett, seconded by Councillor Gondaszewski. All those in favour? That's approved. Thank you very much. receiving of petitions, deputations and presentations. I believe there are none this evening.
None formal, but I thought it was worth a while making a comment that Mr. Boyer here has presented additional pages to his petition, which he presented in December, with 506 signatories in respect to these pages.
So what will happen with that? Will that form part of the original petition? If you could just give us some advice.
Thank you, Mayor. I believe that will form part of the original petition.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, we're dealing then with the confirmation of minutes. Sorry, my iPad keeps jumping around. For the 8th of February ordinary council meeting, can I have a mover and seconder to adopt the minutes, please? Moved by Councillor Hallett, seconded by Councillor Warner. All those in favour? I declare the minutes carried. Announcements by the presiding member. I just have a few. I'd just like to acknowledge that today is International Women's Day and say happy International Women's Day to everyone in the City of Vincent. This year's theme, Break the Bias, talks about representing positive visibility of women in all fields of life. So I'd like to just acknowledge that today. And it is interesting because when we posted this, a member of our community did point to the fact that on the UN agenda, so taking a more global perspective, today is actually for the UN women talking about the world coming together under the theme of global equality today for a sustainable tomorrow, and recognising the role that women have in climate action for women by women. So I thought it was also really important to note that. That does lead to the next item, which I just wanted to mention, that the City of Vincent has announced that we are the first local government to have a fully hybrid and electric car fleet. That is an important part of our plan to reduce our net greenhouse emissions from our energy use, transport and waste to zero by 2030. And always like to say thank you and acknowledge Councillor Dan Loden at this point as chair of the Sustainability and Transport Advisory Group, and being a real champion for us to put that ambitious target forward. Also, just to say that as we're seeing increasing case numbers rising in our community, it's very important that our community understands that the City of Vincent is open, our facilities are running, we're doing that safely, we're meeting all of the requirements that we need to do as part of the government's mandates and restrictions. So our library is open and running, our community centre and Beatty Park, really important for our community's health and wellbeing that we continue to offer these services. Our health team has been providing advice and support to our local businesses, and we've put in place all of the requirements around 2 square metre rule, mask wearing, etc., and that is working well. We have still been able to have some community events. On Sunday, Florida Athena did hold the Mount Hawthorn on the Field event, and they did that safely and meeting the requirements. And we still do have a few more events scheduled coming up this month, but I think in terms of rising case numbers, we're yet to see what will happen in that space. But I think the general principle for the community to know is that we're here, we're open, and it's important to make sure that our community facilities and services are able to help people get through this difficult time. Declarations of interest, CEO.
Through Mayor Cole, none received.
Councillors, any last minute declarations of interest? Okay. Okay, so we've had a couple of items raised by members of the public gallery this evening. We do have some absolute majority decisions that we need to deal with this evening. They are 11.4, the mid-year budget review, and 12.1, appointment of community members to the City of Vincent Audit Committee. But in addition to the items raised by members in the public gallery this evening, are there any further items that council members wish to bring forward for debate? Councillor Oplow.
Thanks, Mayor. I have got a few, but I'll just mention a couple, and if they're not mentioned, if you can circle back to me. 9.1, 9.2, 9. and 11.4 is covered. That's it. 9.1 and 9.2. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Arplo. Councillor Gonchevsky.
Sorry, just let me unmute myself. I would like to discuss 9.9, 10.1 and 12.6.
9.9, 10.1 and 12.6.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Alexander.
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Councillor Castle. Councillor Wallace.
No, thank you, Mayor Cole.
Thank you. Councillor Loden. No, thank you. Councillor Warner.
And Councillor Hallett.
Oh, Councillor Hallett, sorry. You're down the bottom there in the Brady bunch. Councillor Hallett.
No, none from me, thanks.
Okay, all right. Yes, Councillor Arplo.
Sorry, Mayor Cole, is this the appropriate time to mention whether there's a possibility to raise a new motion as communicated
No, we
previously?
do that under urgent business.
Under urgent business?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The CEO will just read out the en bloc items this evening.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Cole, the agenda item numbers being proposed to be moved en bloc are as follows. Item 9.3, item 9.6, item 9.7, item 9.8, item 11.1, 11.2 and 11.3, item 12.2, 12.3, 12.4 and 12.5. That's all, Mayor Cole.
Thank you, Councillor Arplo.
I'm really sorry, Mayor. I actually had a question on 9.3. I'm sorry.
That's fine. I haven't moved it yet.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'll call for a mover and seconder for the en bloc items. Moved by Councillor Loden, seconded by Councillor Warner. All those in favour? Declare the en bloc items carried. Okay, so the first item raised by Janine Lomborn in the public gallery this evening, representing Arranmore Primary School, is in relation to the sale of land at Brentham Street. We do need to deal with item 9.5, which is about the amendment. We talked about this at the briefing in terms of the sequencing of the decision making. So the first item this evening will be 9.5, Amendment 8 to Local Planning Scheme number 2 in relation to number 26 Brentham Street, Leederville. Can I please have a mover and seconder to this item? Moved by Councillor Loden, seconded by Councillor Arplo.
Thank you, Mayor. Just give me a sec to navigate to the right page. Yeah. And that is my dog. Sorry. So
Sounds like we might have an unsteady connection there, Councillor Loden. Any advice there, CEO?
Councillor Loden, you have frozen. I'm not sure if you can still hear us, but we'll probably need you to refresh your connection.
You've got motion now, so give it a go.
Sorry, my internet just died on me. Maybe it was my dog's fault. I think I covered what I wanted to say anyway.
No, we didn't hear anything, so you have to start again. That was your practice run.
I can't remember what I said now. So 9.5 is very much related to 9.4 in terms of the way this works, but we're moving this one because we need to confirm that we're happy to do this step before we can actually consider 9.4. I'm supportive of 9.4, although I would like to see some amendments to that. But as such, I'm also happy to support 9.5 as the officers are recommending. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Loden. Councillor Apollo.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a follow-up question to administration, if I may. The city has prepared Amendment 8, included Attachment 1, to reclassify the subject site from public open space reserve to residential zone with a density code of R60, which I understand would make it permissible for a 3-storey apartment to be built on that block. My question is, is it possible, if we proceed on the course of action that's in front of us, to actually put any constraints on the R60 zoning so that a 3-storey apartment is not possible, particularly around line of sight into the school, and to protect, or to restrict or place constraints around views onto the school where children are located?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if the land transferred into a private hands, then that private owner could submit a development application and it'd be assessed against the planning framework. And it'd be treated against the relevant planning considerations at the time. So a restriction on what a new landowner could do with that land could impact the value of that land.
I just can thank you, CEO. I just to clarify the question, I guess my question is more about, does this council have the ability, or the city have the ability to, as we embark on a tender process for the sale of the land, do we have the ability to restrict or place certain restrictions on the land, given that it is an R60 zoning, that would allow us to place constraints on the development of the land, knowing, and I fully acknowledge that would place some restrictions around the valuation of what the city may be getting from that. But I just want to know if it's permissible to actually add additional restrictions on the development, which would be designed holistically to restrict views into the school.
So I was just wondering, I know that our Director of Strategy and Development is unwell today, but do we have anyone from planning available that could talk through development and how that would have to interact with a sensitive land use like a school? Hello, Manager.
Hello, Manager here, yes. Through
Okay,
you, Mayor Cole. Hello.
Can you just talk through how the development of land adjoining a primary school as a sensitive use would be considered?
Sure. Through you, Mayor Cole. The CEO is correct that the land use of an apartment or multiple dwellings would be permissible on residential zone land if it was to be rezoned to that. Now, ultimately, that would still need to be assessed against the planning framework, primarily the city's built form policy and state government's R codes volume 2. Now, there's different design aspects, different design elements, including visual privacy and separation of those types of sensitive land uses to make sure that it is being developed in a way that respects the adjoining property. So ultimately, there are controls in the planning framework to address different types of aspects of the development, but a multiple dwelling or an apartment development would be permissible under the planning framework for residential zone land.
But are there any overlooking requirements that would be specific in terms of the treatment of a school over, say, a residential neighbour?
To you, Mayor Cole, under the R codes, there is not a specific standard relating to a school. They do, as I mentioned before, do refer to setbacks and privacy, but that's in the context of residential. So non-residential types of uses do not have separate standards.
Thank you. Councillor Apollo.
I guess just to look at so I take it that there's no discretion based on that answer. I guess the alternate way to look at it is, does the City of Vincent have the ability, even though that land is qualifies for R60 zoning, do we have any authority to zone it in a different way? So it's a lower grading, even though I just want to know whether we've got any power to restrict the development potential of the land as part of the tender process. I'm just looking for clarity on that.
Through Mayor Cole, the report is suggesting, administration is recommending a rezoning to R60 in order to have a uniform zoning across the one lot of land. There's currently a split zoning between the street facing block and then the part of the land abutting the school and the aged care centre. So the proposal is to provide a uniform zoning at R60 across the one lot in preparation for it to be sold. It's up to council, and this is the council decision, to initiate that scheme amendment, and it's up to council to decide whether it wants to do that and to what zone that it would like to rezone it to. But our recommendation is R60 to provide a uniform zoning across that single lot. Yes, through you, Mayor Cole, you just reminded me. And we had discussed this with the principal of the school as well. In going through this tender process, there's no obligation on the city to accept the highest value tender when it is received. Council can decide to exercise its discretion to take not the highest offer if it wanted to put a value on the proposed intent of any bidder for, say, a community charitable purpose, the fact that council may prioritise a social outcome, whether it could be around disability, housing, or aged care purposes, or some continuation of the park in a park format, as the CEO of Rosewood Aged Care spoke about at the briefing session last week. So it'll be up to council to decide which bid it proceeds with and what value it wants to put on the intended use of that land. But the city would lose control of that land once the ownership changes. So we have most control over that land now while we own it. It'll be up to a private developer or a private owner to decide what to do with the land if it does change hands.
So I'm sorry to harp on, but just to get the absolute clarity in my mind. So even though we can stipulate when considering the tenderers what the intended land use is, and we can even potentially accept a lower than market value if we so are inclined. But are we saying that if we did that, is it legal, if that constraint legally binding on, like once this transfer of the title is passed, is that those discussions legally binding on the city so that the developer or whoever acquired the property couldn't say one thing to us and then later change their mind?
through you, Mayor Cole, the zoning provides the legal binding parameters for a new owner to consider a development. It's currently zoned for public open space. We would need to contemplate a outcome which was consistent with that zoning if council did want to proceed with the sale.
Can I just ask, this sort of goes to your point though, I mean, in previous situations, we have applied caveats to land. Would that, for example, if you take the example of the Rosewood proposal where there's a dementia garden involved, is that a tool that would be available to council to say that if there is an agreed value based on the outcome, that there could be a caveat for part purpose of the land?
Thank you, Mayor. I was thinking exactly that, what the capacity of it is for council to encumber the land, which then encumbers the future landholder. And I suspect that council could put some encumbrance on it, but of course that will always determine a likely development outcome and drive the market price as a consequence.
Did you want to make any comment, Councillor Uplow?
I think that answers the question. If there is the capacity to do that, depending on how much because I understand the community interest in this particular school, but I also understand that this issue predates my time as councillor and that it's been a issue that has been discussed at some length and it's got quite a lot of history to it. But if there's mechanisms that we can place caveats over the development of it, balanced with the effect on market value, I think that's a good thing to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, perhaps I could just ask a question, Executive Manager. On this item, because the two items are linked, but there wouldn't be anything to prevent council dealing with this item tonight, but then considering having further time to discuss the sale and some of the questions that have been raised around that. Is that correct, that we could potentially move forward with the rezoning, but that doesn't bind us to an outcome in 9.4?
Thank you, Mayor. Each decision stands alone, so simply deciding to rezone a parcel of land doesn't commit council in selling it at all. It just commits it to rezoning it and going through that process.
Just wanted that to be clear. Council members, any other questions? Look, one thing that has come up for me is the land swap that had been completed in the past with Arranmore Primary School, and a few community members and parents of the school did say to me that, they weren't sure that this was a great outcome to end up having this piece of land that's quite separate from Brentham Reserve, that doesn't have great visual access from Brentham Street. And I think, look, I did have a meeting with a parent and I showed them the map of the school and the land swap that took place, and still believe to this day that on the basis of that land swap, which was based on land for land only with no additional purchase, I do genuinely believe that we are in a better position than we were at that point, where we did have City of Vincent land that had school facilities on it, etc. And we weren't able for Arranmore Primary School to fully fence the school. That's something I did discuss with the board chair in between the briefing and the council meeting. So I just thought there had been that discussion about why did we end up with this parcel of land that's disconnected from our broader network of public open space in the vicinity. And I think that, if you go back and look at the land swap, I think that that Arranmore Primary School and the City of Vincent did the best that we could on that straight land for land swap. So it has resulted in this piece of land being disconnected, but really we've landed in a better place overall than where we were. So that, just to give some of the historical context there. Are there any comments before I put the motion? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? Councillor Alexander, I'm not clear which way you're voting. Now frozen at this pivotal moment.
And then
Councillor Alexander, we weren't
Sorry.
sure which way you were voting.
I'd vote to defer it.
Sorry?
I would vote to defer it, or I would vote against it.
Oh, well, we haven't had a deferral motion put to us before we've moved to deal with the motion. So it's a bit late to deal with the deferral at this point because the vote
Okay.
is in process. So does that mean you wish to vote against it?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Noting that Councillor Alexander has voted against that with all other councillors in favour. Okay, we'll then move on to item 9.4, which is the sale of number 26 Brentham Street, Leederville. Can I have a mover and seconder for this item, please? Moved by Councillor Loden, seconded by Councillor Gondaszewski.
Hopefully a bit more success with my internet this time round. So I'm supportive of this proposal. I do have some amendments that I'd like to put forward, but to be honest, I'm actually quite excited about the idea of selling some of this land that is surplus in one location to create public open space in another area. In 2018, we started the process of creating a public open space strategy. And if you look in the council agenda on page 92, there's a fantastic map in there that maps out exactly where all our deficits of public open space are. Now, the agenda papers also talk to the specifics of the Glendalough location, which is the one spot that has a little red dot on it. And that's something that has frustrated me and was a real motivator and driver for me behind supporting this. But it also points out a number of other locations where there's more than 400 metres from a person having to walk to a public open space. And this money that we would generate from the sale of this land is going to be used for that purpose. It's going to be put in the public open space strategy, which is what the proposal sits as doing. And then we're going to identify opportunities to do that. The challenge for me is that we don't actually specify exactly what we're going to do with it. And I would like to see, I'll talk to the amendment when we get to that. But overall, I support this. And I do recognise the concerns raised by by Janine in the gallery and also by members of the community. I feel like the inclusion of the funds to then upgrade the existing space around the school will help with those issues. But I do think we can also do more to engage with that community to then achieve a better outcome with those resources that we're proposing to allocate here. This currently basically allocates funds for that purpose. And I feel like further work needs to be done to try and align those costs and how that money is spent to achieve the best outcome for that location as well. I think there's definitely an opportunity to try and achieve a better outcome with that piece of land other than just it becoming an apartment block. And I think that the proposals that have come forward from the aged care centre next door it has merit and is worth considering. And I've had some discussions with members of the community. Sorry, I've got a small child here. Sorry, buddy. That have also said that they would like to see a better community outcome there as well. And I think I would really like to see that happen too. I don't think the resolution as it stands precludes that opportunity. Yes, you do. Thanks, buddy. Thank you.
Was that it from you, Councillor Loden and Mini Councillor Loden? Yep. Okay, thank you. Moving on to Councillor Gondaszewski.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, I echo Councillor Loden's comments in relation to the motion as it stands does not set in stone a particular direction for this site other than rezoning to a residential zoning and that we've already decided on, and that ultimately then this looks for the city to dispose of this land. There's a multitude of options that could occur through that process, and I would be supportive of perhaps some greater clarity that may come through amendment in relation to the city's intention as to how we will conduct that process and who we can talk to in terms of perhaps to identify future uses of the land that may be more amenable to the school. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, and I visited the site on the weekend, I find it challenging to put my hand in the air for something that in all likelihood will see some established trees be removed and a much loved, play space for children of Arranmore Primary School that could potentially see that removed. We do have a number of schools in the area that utilise public open space adjacent to or close by to the school campus. However, those public open spaces and the facilities within are more readily and have a higher frequency of use by the general community. And in this circumstance, Arranmore Primary is also blessed with 2 open spaces on its boundaries. And so I think that the proposal to work with the school community in relation to the potential relocation of the existing play area so that it can both continue to function as an after-school meeting point for Arranmore parents as well as for the local community. I think that's a positive thing. And I also think that the addition of the public pathway will be great, and tree planting. So I'm very supportive of that. And I'll speak to any amendments that come forward, but this is a challenging one. But as Councillor Loden said, we do have an open space strategy that talks about where we need to access new open space and create new open space. And it does also allow us to discern where there are areas that are well served by open space. And where there is maybe open space that could be create a higher level of community benefit than what we see here tonight. So I'm supportive of the officer recommendation, and we can talk to amendments as they come forward.
Councillors, does anyone wish to speak to the substantive motion? Councillor Loden?
If nobody else wants to speak, I'm happy to move an amendment, if that's all right.
Is that the amendment on the green?
I've just got to figure it out from my. I'll move the one on the blue first.
Okay, the one on the blue.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there a seconder for the amendment on the blue? Seconded by Councillor Castle.
Thank you, ma'am. So this amendment basically seeks to engage with Arranmore Catholic Primary School and Rosewood Care Centre around what the options are for them to make a private treaty for the purchase of this property in advance. So feeding back to those questions raised by Janine in the gallery, it would be a better outcome if we could get this to be used for a purpose that the school will utilise or the aged care facility will utilise. And it's a fairly unique opportunity for them having a piece of land right next door that's undeveloped that they could acquire and do something with. And so I realise this creates an additional step in the process and slows down the process, but I think we have the potential to get a better outcome from this conversation. It doesn't preclude the fact that this, I well recognise it doesn't preclude the fact that this might end up being an R60 zoned piece of accommodation. If that's not successful, I think we really do owe it to those 2 neighbouring residents, and for that matter, any other organisations that would like to partake in the process, to have a go at coming up with something that will work for that piece of land that will still provide the financial resources the city needs to create the much needed public open space elsewhere in the city of Vincent, but still achieve a good community outcome in this location as well. Thank you.
Councillor Castle?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I agree. I support this amendment. I think, as has been mentioned, there's been quite a history with this particular piece of land, and there's been a number of steps that the council has gone through. And I think this is a really welcome addition to the item that we're dealing with, which recognises the particular needs and proximity of both Arranmore and Rosewood, and really gives us a pathway to explore what could be a great outcome for the area without locking council or the city into a particular pathway. I note what Councillor Loden said about slowing down the process, but given that the scheme amendment is likely to take 12 months, I believe, then hopefully this is something that can be investigated in conjunction with that, so that we're not slowing we're not losing too much time in that process. So yes, I'm supportive. I think that it's a good middle ground to both seek a great community outcome for the space, but also really free up some funds for much needed public open space in other areas.
Councillors, Councillor Iapolo.
Thank you, Mayor. I think this is a good tabling of an amendment. The only thing that I would want to flag as a potential amendment to 1.5 being, do you want me to talk about that now?
Well, you can't sort of move the amendment, but if you just want to give us a
Sure.
short
So in essence, pretty
indication,
much
that might help.
along the lines of what we were talking about before about the potential for council to consider any caveat over the property if it went to public sale.
Okay.
So, we've already dealt with this amendment deals with giving the vested, Arramore Catholic Primary School and the Rosewood Care Group as first dibs, if you like, which I think is a great idea. But if should that pass through and you get to a public tender, then I would want some of the conversation that we had reflected in this amendment.
Okay, well, we can come to that once we've dealt with this. I'll come back to you on that. Councillors, any further comments on the amendment? Councillor Gonchevsky.
Just a question from me in relation to the process. Just to confirm that if the city was to, if the city enters this process and was to come to an arrangement with one of the two or both of the two parties for the disposal of the land, is there an obligation on the city to provide public notice and consider any comments or further offers that may come forward through that process?
Through you, Mayor. Yes, private treaty. Perhaps I start from the beginning. The Local Government Act provides 3 avenues for the city to dispose of land, either by public auction, by a public tender, or by a private treaty arrangement. The private treaty arrangement requires that proposal to go out for public submission for a minimum of 14 days. And submissions would be then resubmitted to council, and council needs to consider those submissions and in making a decision give a reason for its decision. So that is the process in respect to private treaty arrangements.
Is there any exceptions in relation to the notice in terms of like benevolent organisations or anything like that?
Through the chair, very good question, Councillor Gonchevsky. There are exemptions to that. I would need to re-look at the section, but there is exemptions for community sporting groups, some not-for-profits, but I think there is some, I don't think it, and state government, but I'm not quite sure how far the not-for-profit exemptions extend, and I'll have a quick look at that.
Okay, I guess from my perspective, I'm supportive of this amendment. However, I do think it is important that the city has a strong understanding of the potential opportunity costs of going down any road that may come of these discussions. This isn't necessarily to say that I wouldn't be supportive of those, sort of a proposal that came forward as a result of these discussions, but I do think that just for transparency, it's really important. I do note that it talks about the that item 2.1 talks to that submissions as a result of 1.1 or 1.4 being presented to council for a potential acceptance of offer. And I'm just wondering whether that would be the point at which council would be able to make a decision to then issue public notice, even if none was required.
Through the chair, just to go back to your earlier question, first of all, the land is exempt disposition if the land is disposed of to a body, whether incorporated or not. where the objects of which are a charitable, benevolent, religious, cultural, educational, recreation, sporting or other like nature. So in respect to Rosewood, would need to be advertised because that is a business. In respect to the school, it wouldn't need to be advertised given the educational background to it. Nothing restricts the city from advertising a disposition proposal regardless of the legislation. So even if the legislation says it's an exempt disposition, it doesn't mean that council can't go out and advertise that regardless and seek submissions.
Okay, all right. I think there's probably enough there for me to support this as written.
Councillors, I know that I prepared this with you, Executive Manager, but I'm just wanting to clarify. Clause 1.3 says, as a requirement of the above selection, administration will present submissions from the local public notice to council to consider prior to determining the sale. So just to be clear, we go through this initial process where we specifically go to Aaron Moore Primary School or Sisters of Mercy and to Rosewood Care Group. We go through that process, local notice, and then whatever the result of that is, it comes back to council and there's another decision point.
Unless that decision point is delegated to the CEO, yes, it comes back to council.
But there's no delegation that I read into this. I just want to make sure that.
That's correct.
Yes, right. So I guess what I'm saying is that by introducing this amendment, it provides the opportunity for the City of Vincent to explore those two options with Rosewood and Aaron Moore Sisters of Mercy, and whatever the result of that, it will then come back to council again for another point in the decision making. I think that's important because since last Tuesday, I think myself and other council members have made quite significant attempts to talk to representatives of the school community. I know that, Janine, thank you for your time the other day with David McLennan and Peter Varis, our executive manager, to talk this through. And I had come into this meeting with an understanding that the school was not necessarily supportive and welcoming of the sale, but yet there had been enough discussion and enough explanation that there was an understanding of how the city was approaching this from the strategic perspective of the public open space strategy, which is very important, but also taking it to that micro level that in response to the community submissions, and particularly from the children who are very attached to the play space, that in response to that community consultation, that we were then looking at how could we further develop this in terms of exploring the option that's been put forward by Rosewood, which I think would potentially be a great outcome for both the, not just for Rosewood, but for the school, talking about that intergenerational interaction, and to explore this as a first path. I think that's really important, and that's why the amendment has been tabled. There are other discussions that have happened around providing, and this is probably not speaking to this amendment, so I might hold those comments because that's kind of going into other matters. But this for me was really about being responsive to some of that feedback that had come back through the school community. And it does allow council to go down that path and talk about, can we sell the land in this way and what benefit does that provide back to the neighbouring landowners. And I think that's an important first step, and then it will then come back to council. So before there's consideration of anything beyond that, it would be coming back into the chamber. There would have been a lot of dialogue with Rosewood and the school community through that process. So I think this adds a really important an initial step in this process, which is going from selling the land on an open process and drawing it back into having that very preliminary discussion about the adjoining landholders to see what can come from that. So I think that's a really important step to add through this amendment. Are there any further comments or questions on the amendment? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? It's carried by all. We're back to the substantive motion. Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll use that as some momentum to put forward the amendment. I think it's on the green for 9.4.
Thank you. I'll just see if there's a seconder. Seconded by Councillor Gontaszewski.
Thank you, ma'am. So this basically adds in a new 2.3, asking administration to assess the options for creating POS through lease, land acquisition and roads to reserves in the locations identified with the public open space strategy as having a deficit of POS, which, to be honest, is really what the public open space strategy already says. So that kind of reinforces that point, that that's what we will be doing with these funds. And the second part is to where there is the opportunity to repurpose road to public open space, to bring that forward as a concept. And the aim there is to try and create a space of equivalent size that might not be practical in every location, or it might be spread over multiple locations of what we are losing elsewhere. So if we can aim to try and at least get close to that, that's what the intent is here behind this amendment. And the reason for including that is because if we're not converting some of our own land into public open space, we're looking at really an acquisition strategy or a lease strategy. And both of those, the lease strategy doesn't permanently secure the land, so that's probably your ultimate backup plan. You can't do anything else. An acquisition strategy is going to take a long time because we have to complete all the sale, and then we have to go and wait for somebody to want to sell their piece of land, and also for that to be in the exact right location for where we need it, and also at the right price. I mean, it depends on where we look, but if you look at Glendalough, that's quite a high zoned area. So there is potential risk that we won't be able to afford to buy the piece of land that does come up. And I'm concerned that we may literally sell this land and then there'd be no benefit that comes to the community for the better part of a decade. And that is absolutely not the outcome that we want to see. So from my perspective, I look at the city of Vincent owns half the land in the city, the other half being owned by residents and businesses. And the reason why we have a lack of public open space is because we have an absolute plethora of roads. There are roads everywhere. You look on those maps, there's roads everywhere. And we do not need all of those roads. We would only need to allocate a very, very small percentage of them to be public open space. And we'd have the highest connection to public open space of any community in the Perth region, I would hazard a guess. The other thing is that it's very, very cheap. One of the things that came out the back of the public open space strategy was a quick win, which was to convert the Hyde Street Reserve to road to a reserve. And so for the councillors that weren't around at the time, we allocated $220,000 in the budget, and that expanded on an existing park, basically converted the neighbouring road into additional parkland and created an additional, I think it was 800 square metres of public open space for $220,000 plus an extra 20 grand thrown in by federal member Tim Hammond at the time for some solar lights. Just absolute huge bang for buck. If we look at the quantum of money that we can potentially obtain through the sale of this land and then spread that out, we could basically fix our entire public open space strategy and have money left over to spare, right? Like in one go. Like I'm really excited about this, which is why I'm amending this one, because I really want to see us to get onto this opportunity. I did have a look at the potential locations where we can have it. I did send a rather long email to the CEO and the director around where all those potential locations are. But there's, sorry, let me pull it up. Just in the Glendalough area, we could actually look at nearly any of those streets with converting that road into a reserve. You do have to get over the challenge of access to the property in question, but you can manage that by putting in large footpaths that then also serves as a road to enable access to those properties. And there's a brilliant example from Kooyong to St Kilda Road in Laff Lane, where they removed an entire stretch of road for a length of 400 metres and converted, so they created 4,000 square metres of public open space by converting a road. They also had the verges on either side, which is about 5 metres wide. So that's 8,000 square metres of public open space. So if you used our benchmark of 800, that would be about $2.2 million that would cost to create 8,000 square metres of public open space, which is very impressive and would be a real value and asset to our community. I think that's all I had to say on that. So I'll let others speak.
Thank you, Councillor Loden. Councillor Iapolo.
Thanks. Can I just get clarification? Is this amendment on the amendment just 2.3? Because we've got two amendments that have been tabled, so I just want clarity. Is it just the what is in 2.3?
It's been presented as amendment to 2.3 and 2.4.
2.4, okay. 2.3 seems to me, like I agree with everything that Councillor Loden has said, but to me, unless I'm misunderstanding his point, that's a bigger issue, and I'm not sure how it's relevant to this specific piece of land. Can I get some clarity from administration on what amended 2.3 specifically would mean in relation to the sale of this subject property?
Through the Mayor, it essentially conditions that the administration comes back to council with some options that we have thought about, not beyond the sale of the land, but have also thought about options of applying those funds derived to create public open space in those shortfall areas. So it's actually looking for additional work towards that end.
But would I be right to say that administration does that as part of its ongoing business? So it would have those plans. I'm just wondering why we have to staple it to this particular sale.
Through you, Mayor Cole, I think the concept, I'm speaking on behalf of Councillor Loden here, is embedded in the public open space strategy was the concept of essentially recycling underutilised areas of public open space for higher value pieces of public open space in areas of higher need. And Councillor Loden did introduce this amendment by saying this is reiterating what Council's already endorsed in terms of the public open space strategy, that where Council decides to sell a piece of land, that would go into a public open space reserve in order to meet the objectives of public open space across the City of Vincent.
Councillors, comments or questions? Councillor Gonciewski.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I'm very supportive of this. I'm supportive of both parts of the recommendation. Whilst I do agree with Councillor Iapolo that there's no specific direction to administration in relation to item 2.3, and that it, and as Councillor Loden has said, that it does replicate some of the requirements that arise out of the public open space strategy. I do feel that that it is appropriate for council to include that here as some further direction to administration that this is tied to this process. We have heard that we don't want the school community to feel as though they are potentially foregoing a community asset, and that the broader community is not going to see a community benefit from that loss. I am also supportive of the idea of putting a figure of 1,700 square metres into item 2.4, so that it is clear that it is council's direction that we shouldn't be looking at an overall reduction in our open space provision, rather that this is looking at potentially a redistribution of our open space across the network. And thirdly, I'd also like to reiterate my support for roads to parks, but possibly just assure anyone watching at home that we're not coming for your cars, that if you go to Hyde Street Reserve, you're ultimately going to see that the open space has been delivered without any significant loss of road utilised by the local residents or impeding access to their homes. And I think that these are projects that can really be delivered to provide a fantastic benefit, both to the broader community, but also to the residents that are immediately located adjacent to the proposed new open space. So I'm highly supportive of this. And whilst the wording in 2.4 is not directive, I just want to use this opportunity to say that I really think there's some strong opportunities here, and I'm looking forward to administration progressing the work that's already been done, and bringing forward some options and some engagement methods for the community.
Councillors, Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I'm supportive of this amendment as well, and really thank Councillor Loden for his continued enthusiasm and championing of roads to reserves in particular. It's clearly a project that he feels very passionate about, and I really appreciate the amount of research that he's done into opportunities, because I do think that what we've realised through this process and through other conversations around public open space is our opportunities to dispose of land are limited, and our opportunities to acquire it are even more limited. So we need to be both creative and ambitious. And I think that is something that underpins the entire public open space strategy. Is it's not simply status quo or making sure that everyone has a park in their neighbourhood, although that element of it is important, but it is also we have targets to increase that public open space. And where we're talking about repurposing a road and we actually have more options and more opportunities to use more space, I think we should be doing everything we can to do that. I think Councillor Gontaszewski's point about embarking on this in good faith with the community is really important too, because the last thing that we would like our community to feel is that these decisions are made without great thought and without a balance of what the community benefit is as a whole to Vincent. So if one area of Vincent is to lose some access to public open space, it really needs to be justified that there will be another community that will gain that access that's greatly needed. So I think this is a really good way to be very clear, both to administration and to the community, about what our intentions are, and to make sure that the pathway is clear.
Councillors? Look, on this amendment, also do support it. And the reason why is I think, again, the community consultation has been that, you know, we talk about our public open space strategy, and we can say, here is our strategy. It talks about the fact that the City of Vincent must increase land overall in the City of Vincent, and we also must make the best use of the land that we have. And it talks about how we do that. And some of that is looking at underperforming land. Some of it is looking at where we have an abundance of land, where we have a shortfall, and some of it is around those innovative solutions that Councillor Loden has talked about, in terms of land may not necessarily be available to buy, but we can still look at how we can create that public open space. What this amendment does, from my perspective, is it creates, we've already we can show there's a need, but we also need that nexus, so that when we are saying that we're looking at this piece of land, and this is something that the parent community has raised with me, and also Janine, you've raised this with me as well, like, can we actually point to what we're going to do with this funding? We can say that we're going to earmark it in our public open space reserve, and that we have a strategy that says that we must grow our open space, but it's really been demonstrated to me in these conversations that our community wants to know if we're giving this up, because there has to be an acknowledgement that for those people who have used that space and are next door to that space, there is a loss. So how are we going to use the funding, and how are we actually meeting our strategic objectives, and where is it going to go? So this amendment really helps to do that. And the original 2 point, I think the intent from administration was that could happen to a degree, but this actually really says that when we actually come back and we're making that decision on sale, we need to be able to demonstrate through this additional body of work what we're going to do with the money. So this for me is quite critical to the decision, and it's critical to the feedback that we've had through this process. So I do support the amendment. Any further comments or questions on the amendment? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. We're back to the substantive motion. Any further comments or amendments? Councillor Apollo.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the format of the current amendment is. Is it because all I want to do is have a look at whether we can imbue a small amendment that would also consider any caveat on the development of the land if it wasn't sold to either Arranmore or to the aged care facility.
Just one thing to consider though, Councillor Apollo,
Sure.
is that this would come back after that process. So before there would be any open tender process, this process now includes, because it's been amended, it now includes that we would just go to the neighbouring landowners before we would then entertain a further wider process.
Okay, point taken. I think
I'm just still up to you, but I think that's
it covers
it
it
might
off.
be that that's the sort of thing we consider at the next stage.
The only thing that I guess this amendment doesn't take into account, and perhaps administration can clarify, but what happens if under 1.1 Arranmore and or Rosewood under private treaty were looking to partake in a sale? Does this permit us to do that if they were only wanting to take part of the land and not the whole thing? Because, for example, Arranmore might only want the bit adjoining their property rather than the whole thing, or is it that it would be incumbent on them to acquire the whole thing, subdivide, and then sell off at their own risk the remainder?
Through the chair, the intent is to sell it as whole, notwithstanding that initial contact recently with the Sisters of Mercy has made it quite clear that they're not interested in acquiring the land. However, we'd still go to them and put the proposition to them. So the intent is to pursue the sale of the entire lot. Notwithstanding that wouldn't mean that either the school or Rosewood would come back to the city with other options. They would still be presented to the city. And at that time, council may consider whether they'd accept those. And if they don't, then they'll need to start thinking about the manner of the sale and the tender and the conditions. And by that time, we'd be able to have some fairly firm advice about what impact encumbrances and what type of encumbrances may be able to be put onto that land to control the development if council should wish to pursue that.
And just the other point on 1.5, the amended 1.5, this, I think, just for clarity, it seems to be in a situation where it goes to public tender, that the CEO can dispose of it via public tender, but it doesn't, even though 1.5 talks about including terms of sale, offer and conditions, that doesn't mean that it has to come back to council as it's currently drafted in terms of any possible caveat.
Through the chair, the CEO doesn't have delegation to be able to dispose of land beyond a certain value, which is, I think, 400,000 off the top of my head. So the tender would need to come back to council unless council chooses to delegate that decision to the CEO.
Councillors, any further amendments or comments? Look, I do just want to speak to some of the issues that have come up during the week, because during the week I have spoken to a number of people about this, including representatives of the school board. And I do want to acknowledge that when we look at selling land that is adjoining to, whether it's a resident to a land use of school and it's being used, that there's definitely a sense of loss. And I can understand that when we put this out for consultation, we weren't really very good at demonstrating. We talked about public open space strategy, but we weren't really good at being concrete about what we were going to do with the land sale proceedings, and that's that need and nexus discussion. One of the things that became very apparent to me is that the children are very wedded to and reliant upon the playground, and that's used for them on a daily basis. So in terms of considering how we then acknowledge that and what contribution we make back to that, the responses from receiving that feedback has been to have a landscape plan which would take part as part of any proceedings of sale. That amount has been set at $299,000 in the recommendation, and that would go towards a new playground and an extension of the existing pathway, which would create a full walkable connection between Britannia to Burke Street, which takes you half the way from Mount Hawthorn to Leederville through a greenway, and creates a continuation of that path, which has been really well utilised by Rosewood residents, kids on scooters, people in wheelchairs, etc. So it's created an ability for that greenway to really be well utilised. So in terms of how we would deal with that, I do take the point, and this is something that a board representative raised with me, is that the playground would have to be proximate to the school so that managing children during recess and lunchtime can be manageable within the existing teaching cohort and the way in which teachers are on duty. That's something that we faced when we talked about the Braithwaite playground. We built the fantastic playground there. We thought the school at Mount Hawthorn, which is very low on play space, would be able to go across every day and use it. But of course, when you're spreading your observation of children across a school, plus you're adding in going across a bridge to another play space, that just wasn't a pragmatic daily occurrence for the school. They do use the playground, but they do it on specific days and for specific events. So if we want to be able to have Arranmore continue to use the playground in the way that they do use existing playground, we would need to look at the location and make sure that's proximate. And the landscape plan is the place to allow that to happen. The landscape plan looks at local improvements to the immediate adjoining owners. So the pathway would be beneficial to Rosewood, the playground would be beneficial to the school. So it's about giving something back when there has been a loss, because we do need to acknowledge that that is a loss for the school. It is really important that we balance the community need, and we do have to do that because as council members, our obligation is to look at need across the city of Vincent, and we've done that through our public open space strategy, and that's the vehicle to make these decisions. But we also need to balance that with and understand that there has been a long-term use of the land and the playground and make a contribution back. I have talked at length with about how we can manage that we know that we're really keen to put in place this process, which we have done tonight now, that first of all explores that ability for the neighbours to purchase the land if they wish to. And I think having had conversations during the week where I thought that the school were perhaps in a position where they understood why we were doing what we did, but hearing some of Janine's comments tonight did concern me to think about whether that's, that perhaps after having time to contemplate, there's been a shift in thinking. But I think that the amendments that we've put in place tonight really go to dealing with those concerns that have been raised, and will allow us to explore that further and have a much more detailed conversation with Janine, with the school community. And I think that, then we'll have another decision point at which we consider the land sale, where we can have an even better and deeper understanding of that before we take this further. So I feel that where we've landed has been very responsive to the feedback that we've received. We have taken on board the community sentiment, and we've put in place measures to deal with that. And we're also still trying to achieve our community objectives of creating more public open space in the city of Vincent in line with our public open space strategy. So these decisions are hard, and we always have to take a measured approach where we have to weigh up the pros and cons in this way. But I think that where we're landing tonight with these amendments, I think is a way that we're demonstrating that we're able to hear all views and all opinions and try to make sure that we in some way cater for everyone within our community. Any further comments? Okay, I'll put the motion. Oh, Councillor Alexander, do you wish to speak?
No, look, I'm very supportive of the amendments. I think that's a good idea. I understand that you've had some discussions, negotiations with them, which is a good thing, but I guess they weren't as responsive as they could have been, but you know, this gives them another opportunity. So I'm supportive of the amendments.
Thank you. We're back at the substantive. So just to be clear, we're voting on the substantive now. So if you did have anything further to say, now is the opportunity before we take the vote. Everyone clear on that? Okay, thank you for your comments, Councillor Alexander. I'll now put the vote. All those in favour of the motion? That's unanimous. Thank you very much, councillors. I probably should just say at this point, we don't actually have any item of business that's dealing with the kiosk this evening. Perhaps, Councillor Apollo, if we just go to your point, you did want to raise an urgent motion, and we did have some advice back from Welga that if that does come forward, because of the fact that we're dealing with legal and commercial issues, that will have to be dealt with confidentially. So I just wanted to let members of the public gallery know that if you are waiting for another debate on the kiosk, that won't be happening in the this evening, and we do have the motions coming back from the electors meeting next month. Did you want to elaborate on that at this point?
Thank you, Mayor. You got it pretty well, 100% correct. Given the nature of the discussion, it would need to be behind closed doors and not in open forum.
So it is possible for you to bring forward an urgent motion, but Welga's advice is that because of the nature of the discussion, it can't be in the public realm, and next month's discussion can be. Yep. So just to be clear, no, sorry. Moving on to then, so that they are the items that have been raised in public gallery this evening. So we can go back to the beginning of the agenda and just deal with the items sequentially. So item 9.1 is 31 Smith Street, Highgate, proposed alterations and additions to a place of worship. Councillor Apollo, you were keen, do you want to move this one?
Yes.
And seconded by Councillor Wallace.
Thank you, Mayor. So I don't really have any issues with supporting this agenda item, but because I was late to the briefing meeting, I didn't have a chance to participate in any debate and ask a question. But given that the City of Vincent cherishes its heritage properties, I think it's probably worth tabling a couple of questions. The subject site currently contains a Serbian Orthodox church at the front of the lot and a two-storey hall, Sunday school and office building to the rear. The church was constructed in 1954 and the hall was constructed in 1962. My question to administration is the entire site collectively representing the church and the hall the subject of the heritage listing, or is it just the church? I just wanted clarity on that.
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's the former, it's the entirety of the site. In terms of the heritage listing, if you refer to what aspects of the site then contribute to this significance, the heritage significance, that's set out in the statement of significance in the officer report as well. And that is primarily the church at the front of the lot.
Thank you. And that confirms because I was sitting here reading this wondering why it's coming to council, because this one did look quite straightforward. And I worked it out that if it was the entire site, that the alterations and additions to buildings to places included on the State Register of Heritage Places is something that the CEO doesn't have delegated authority for. So that's why this is coming to council, and that kind of answers my question as to why this is coming. The second question, then given that this is more for future heritage, consideration of future developments on heritage listing properties, is a question for administration. Does the fact that obviously the church is a more significant part of the heritage listing, as indicated in the applicant's heritage listing impact, where they keep talking about how the modifications that this development application is proposing is to the rear, to the hall, and which is detached from the church. So the applicant's own submissions were downplaying the works being done to the heritage property. My question more for administration for future reference is, does the same level of consideration need to be given to all parts of the subject site that is subject to heritage listing? Or is it the fact that, you know, any changes to, say, a lesser, perceived lesser important part of it doesn't hold the same level of consideration than, I guess, the more significant part of the heritage listing? And I ask it too because this property, the hall at the back, has been subject to a number of changes over the years, including in a very significant amount of renovation in 2017. And I'm just, for my own benefit, and again, for future reference, I'm wondering whether the same level of consideration applies to the whole subject site, where the whole thing is subject to a heritage listing. Thank you.
Through you, Mayor Cole, it would apply to the entire site. There is an addition granted to the rear in this instance, and that rear building does not have a high level of significance. But nonetheless, whether development or new works is proposed to, for example, in this instance, to the church at the front of the building or to the rear, it still needs to be done in a respectful way that is sympathetic to the cultural heritage of that site. So irrespective of whether the works were proposed to the church itself at the front of the property or whether it was done to the rear, it would still need to be done in a way that is respectful. And I guess that's the purpose of the city's local planning policy around heritage management. It sets out these principles, and that's the assessment that administration went through and forms the crux of the report before you.
Okay, and just for absolute clarity then, comments like when this council is reading things like the heritage impact statement for future reference, if that type of document is referring to comments that are saying that the development works are not part of the main church and separated from the main church, that's irrelevant in many respects. If the whole site is a heritage listing property, then the same considerations apply. So that's really just a point of clarity for my future reference.
Through Mayor Cole, yeah, my advice would be that you would still need to have regard for the purposes of the relevant planning policy that applies. And in this instance, it's the heritage policy. And I suppose irrespective if you have additions to the rear component, and if that rear component has a lower level of heritage significance, that's okay, but you would still need to consider its appropriateness because you would be viewing that in the context of the broader site, which has obviously the church as well. So it needs to still speak to the building to the front of the lot, and ultimately it can't detrimentally impact that heritage significance of the site. And that's what a heritage impact statement does. It really breaks down the components of the site that has higher significance versus those aspects of the site which may have lower significance.
Thank you. I'll take it offline for any specific, but in the context of this application, I'm happy. Thank you.
That was seconded by Councillor Wallace. Any comments, Councillor Wallace?
No, thanks, Mayor Cole. Happy to support the motion as written.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace. Any further comments or questions on this item? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour? I declare that carried. Next item is 9.2, 188 Vincent Street, North Perth, proposed alterations and additions to a second place of worship. Moved by Councillor Oppolo, would you like to move? I think you pulled this one forward too. You happy to move it? Move, okay, moved by Councillor Oppolo, seconded by Councillor Warner.
Thank you. There's another heritage listed property and another treasure within the city of Vincent. The reason I just wanted to talk to this, and again, I don't have any, subject to any other information from fellow councillors, I don't have a real issue, but again, just a point of clarity. So the reason why this is coming to council is because there is two items that require council to exercise its discretion to approve the application, because these points would otherwise fail the deemed to comply provisions. And that relates to the use of copper on the roof with less solar absorbance rating prescribed by the build form policy, and changes to the pitch of the roof not permitted by the heritage management policy. I concur with administration's recommendation that the change to the roof pitch is acceptable on the basis that it attempts to resolve existing drainage issues caused by subsequent alterations to the original building. I have no problem with that. The second point was in relation to the second aspect being the use of copper on the roof. The seamed copper is already used on the building, specifically I don't know if I can pronounce this, sacristy. The administration has made the comment that the use of the existing material assists with integrating the roof and the existing building. But my understanding is from the room, this is where the priests change, that this is probably copper on the internal part of the building. I just wanted to get clarity, because administration in the briefing note didn't really talk about justifying the approval of this point, which would otherwise not comply with the heritage management policy.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that page that Councillor Oppolo is referring to is in the comment section of the officer report, and it's under the dot point of the roof. And Councillor Oppolo is correct in that that was part of the consideration, the materiality. That's one way of being sympathetic to the heritage value of a place. The following dot point alludes to the solar absorbance specifically. So it states that the use of the lighter colour, which is less than 0.4 solar absorbance material, would not be appropriate in this situation, and that's because it wouldn't be in keeping with the character of the heritage place and would not assist in integrating the works with the existing building design. So that requirement around the solar absorbance is actually taken from the city's built form policy, and that's set out in the departures table earlier in the report. Now, the city's built form policy around solar absorbance is really around environmentally sustainable built form. That is not specific to this scenario, this heritage situation where you've got a certain materiality outcome where you need to be considering the aesthetic of the build. So in this particular situation, using a lighter colour would not tie in to the materiality and aesthetics of this heritage listed property, and that's been confirmed by the city's DRP member with heritage conservation expertise. So for those reasons, it was appropriate to depart from a material of less than 0.4 solar absorbance.
Yep, no, I maybe misunderstood my question. That's the part that fails the deemed to comply provisions about the roof, and I was saying that I'm happy with that, and I agree with the administration's position on that. The one where I wanted some clarity was the heritage management policy, which relates to the requirement that the additions and alterations do not alter the original facade or roof pitch. And the proposal is saying that is proposing that standing seam copper roof at 3 degrees over the working sacristy and adjacent corridor. And the reason given by administration for allowing this was because there was copper use elsewhere in the building in that sacristy room. But I just wanted clarity on that, because it's one of the only two things that we need to consider as a departure from policy. And I wasn't clear as to why administration were happy to allow that deviation.
Sure, through you, Mayor Cole. The reference to the use of copper was tied into the keeping or tying in with the character of that build, as I just spoke to. So that's the copper reference. In terms of why the angle of the roof pitch is appropriate, as you correctly identified, that's one of the departures being sought through this proposal. That's covered in that first dot point, which basically refers to the fact that there's existing drainage issues, and to assist with that management of stormwater moving forward. It's a simpler roof form, and that 3 degrees slope would ultimately allow that water runoff to be better maintained in the future, and avoid the scenario that we're currently experiencing, where there's water damage from roof leaks and such. So that 3 degree sloping roof is ultimately intended to be a simplified roof form to assist with the stormwater management. Again, that's been tested with our DRP member with heritage conservation value and appropriate for that area.
Okay, I'm sorry. I apologise because I'm not communicating my question well enough. I'm happy with the roof pitch and because it's fixing the drainage problem, but under the table where it talks about heritage management policy, it specifically says that what they're doing is to replace the iron. It says this would be replacing the existing corrugated iron roof and adjacent clay tile roof with 30 degree pitch. Okay. But what I was getting confused about was the reference to the copper, that it's the material, and the copper, it would be considered, as I read this agenda item, that would be making an alteration to the original facade. That's where I'm getting tied up with this. And I know it's not a big, I didn't want to have made this a bigger issue than it is because I'm supportive of the change, but I just wanted to clarify. There was a comment made in this brief, and I'll find the exact location, about the use of copper specifically on the roof because it was used in other parts of the building. The proposed modifications to the roof of the corridor and the replacement of the working sacristy roof is appropriate. The copper roof is an appropriate replacement material. But there was a comment somewhere that I read that talked about it being an existing material in the building. So I'm just wanting to get clarity whether it's just because that's the best replacement from iron roof to copper. Maybe you're saying that, which is not clear from this brief, that the use of copper material also helps the drainage, or whether copper as a substitute material for the roof is because it is also used in the building elsewhere, but there was no comment about where, like, on that particular point. So I just wanted to get clarity about the use of copper in the building. And I'm sorry I'm bringing up this now rather than the briefing session, like I said from the outset. It's just that I was late to the briefing session. I didn't have an opportunity to talk to this agenda item.
Through you, Mayor Cole. Yes, so that table that refers to the heritage management policy, the acceptable development standard says that you should not alter the original facade or the roof pitch. Now they're proposing to alter the roof pitch. So that is what the departure is to the acceptable development standard. Okay, so that's, there's some commentary, as I spoke to before, they're changing it from 30 degrees to a 3 degree slope. Now the reference to copper is on page, just to clarify, it's on page 34 of the agenda, and there's a dot point called roof, and there's a number of subsequent dot points following that. So Councillor Appelar, I believe you're referring to the second dot point under roof, which refers to seam copper. Seam copper is already used in the building, specifically that sacristy portion of the building, and that the use of the copper material is sympathetic and would integrate the roof form itself with the rest of the building and the heritage place. So the copper reference is about how we're using sympathetic material for this type of work, okay? It doesn't inform why the roof needs to be 3 degrees. That is dealt with in the following dot points that I've already spoke to, in that it would be a simplified roof form and assist with stormwater management moving forward. Copper is really the reference to copper. It's not a specific departure to the policy framework. The relevance of copper is that we need to make sure that the materiality is sympathetic to the existing building. There's existing copper used on the building, and that's why it's an appropriate material to use. I hope that clarifies it.
It does, and I guess my question really was whereabouts is the copper? If it is it on the roof already because we're replacing the whole roof with copper, or is it something that's just used in one particular room on the interior, and whether that's significant for our decision making?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's latter. It's used elsewhere internal, and I guess that together with the remainder of the build makes up the heritage aesthetic. So it ties into that materiality. Again, it's the roof, so it's limited in terms of visibility and the visual appearance. So again, it's not like it's the facade of the build in terms of being highly prominent, but still that subtle roof materiality ties into copper used elsewhere within the building.
Okay, thank you. I'm supportive of this item. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any further comments or questions on this item? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Declare that carried. That takes us to item 9.9, advertising of new policy, draft vibrant public places policy. Oh, apologies. I think that's because I'd originally crossed it out, but then we did reinstate 9.3. Apologies. We'll go back to 9.3, which is number 3, Elmer Road, Mount Lawley, proposed group dwelling amendment to approved. Councillor Opler, I think you also raised this, so we'll take you as the mover. And seconded by Councillor Gonchevsky.
Thank you, Mayor. So this is a curious one for me. So this is requesting approval to amend a DA previously approved on 30 April 2019, subject to the same conditions, except in relation to condition 6.3 relating to size and specifications of fixed planted block boxes on the roof terrace and its screening effect. Justification being because one of the design modifications was to remove the roof terrace completely. Understand that. This is coming back to council because A, previous council approved certain planning elements that were outside deemed to comply at that time, and now must be reconsidered in light of any changes, and certain changes have now been made which require further discretion. My question to administration, my first question is there any expiry to a previously approved development application, noting that this application is amending something that was approved dated 30 April 2019?
Through you, Mayor Cole, there is an expiry date. The decision is attached to, ordinarily it would be for a period of 2 years. And under the current minister's exemptions, there should be an additional 2 years to that period of time. I'll just pull up the plans. Yes, that's correct. So a total of 4 years would be the expiry date when the development needs to substantially commence. So from the date of that decision in 2019.
Thank you for clarifying that. The second question, if previous council approval was granted for planning elements that did not satisfy deemed to comply provisions and an application is resubmitted with changes, does administration and therefore council need to reassess the approval for these planning elements, including consideration of such changes since the original application?
Through you, Mayor Cole. Yes, the council, as well as administration, in undertaking the assessment, needs to consider the scope of the modifications. There's amendments listed in the context of that broader application.
Thanks for clarifying. So on that basis, how can council or the present council know whether the planning elements on page 2 in the table under the column previously approved, let's pull it up, that being street setback, front fence, building setbacks, boundary wall, building height, stories and privacy, and essential facilities.
I think there's might be a miscommunication here, if I could just clarify. I think Councillor Uplo's question is, now that this has come back with a further change to the development approval, does that then open up the previously approved discretion for reassessment? And the answer is no. Because once a development approval has been granted, then you're just looking at the additional discretion.
And
that's my understanding, Manager?
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. Perhaps I'll just elaborate. That is what you advise is correct. So you need to consider what those amendments are, and if they related to, seeking further departure, and you might have already, or council might have already previously approved that, then that's within the scope of that application, and that is up for grabs. But those elements that have previously been supported remain as is, and which is why that hasn't been fleshed out any further in the officer report. We've just identified where further discretion is being sought from council.
thanks for clarifying that. So is the answer the same though on that question if the planning guidelines like the design build form or whatever actually change in the period?
Once a development approval is granted, it's in perpetuity. It's an interesting part of planning.
Yep. Then all we're doing is, or all we're asked to do is to assess this application on the basis of the changes and only revisit those aspects if they have themselves been changed. Thank you for clarity. Nothing further.
Thank you, Councillor Uplow. That was seconded by Councillor Gonchevsky. Do you have any questions or comments? Okay. Councillors, any further comments or questions on this item? Okay, I'll put it. All those in favour? Declare the item carried. Thank you very much, Mr. Naidu, for your advice. And we'll move on now to item 9.9, advertising of new policy, draft vibrant public spaces policy. Can I have a mover for this item? Moved by Councillor Gonchevsky. Sorry, don't know what's going on. It's a mask. Moved by Councillor Gonchevsky, seconded by, was that your hand, Councillor Hallett? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Cole. I'd like to reserve my right to speak until after I've put forward a couple of amendments.
Okay, I'll go to the seconder. Councillor Hallett, any comments on the substantive motion?
Thank you, Mayor. Just to say, I think this is a really exciting and unique, approach that City of Vincent takes around our public spaces, and it's really nice to see this come forward, and particularly the level of detail around the different types of use of public space and the importance of supporting our local businesses. Having said that, I am supportive of potentially some amendments because I have raised concerns previously around, the idea of public space being privatised for extended periods. But I think there's a balance that we can achieve the outcomes that we want to get out of this policy, but also ensuring that some of that space is maintained as much as possible for public use.
Thank you, Councillor Hallett. Any further comments before we go back to Councillor Gonchevsky for an amendment? Over to you, Councillor Gonchevsky.
I've got two amendments, so I'll just open them up. The first relates to, hold on, what colour is it on? Oh, well, on mine it's on just on the white. It's in relation to modification of table 1 around and the deletion of the location reserved public open space.
Can I have a seconder for the amendment, please? Seconded by Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. Look, this amendment seeks to remove parks and reserves from the scope of this policy, essentially. I'm not satisfied there's a need to include open space in the policy, as the drive has really been related to businesses within our town centres and along our activity corridors. I think we've actually got issues with managing our open spaces, and I'm not sure that we need to be seeking to allow that process to be driven externally to the city. I think that ultimately when the city is seeking to add amenity or to activate a particular open space and it's determined that this is best offered by a private entity, the city already has options under existing policy and law to facilitate this, such as our events policy, our hire of reserves, land disposition provisions, or the mobile vendors policy. And if the city wants to seek private contributions to the implementation of facilities in the public realm, then I suspect that this would be better dealt with via the sponsorship policy that's currently under review. So that's, sorry, I just had a pop-up saying I had a message from Tara, but that's on not my screen. Yeah, so that's essentially my the intention behind this. I've been fairly upfront about this through all the preliminary discussions, and so this is why I'm bringing this forward today.
Councillor Hallett.
Nothing much to add to that. Support the reasons that Councillor Gonchaszewski has said. I think there are lots of opportunities to activate public space that is in reserves through other mechanisms, and yeah, don't really see it as a component of this approach.
Councillors, any further comments? Look, I will comment. I do think that it's worth trying this eatlet concept in town centres and other built-up areas. In our parks and reserves, we currently have buildings. You know, we're obviously going through a kiosk, been dealing with a kiosk in Hyde Park. We've got a mobile food truck vendor. We've got policy. We have also buildings, and we have, you know, sporting clubs that run kiosks out of those buildings. So you could see that there could be a way of introducing further presence in the parks through, say, leases, which would be guided by the property management framework, which is probably something that might have been worth raising earlier when we had that question about City of Vincent running commercial operations. We do have a property management framework that deals specifically with how we lease and manage and license our buildings. So I don't think there's a need at this time, and I don't see that this is the appropriate policy to apply. So I support the amendment. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? Yep, everyone's voted in favour. So we're back to the substantive motion. Councillor Gonchaszewski.
Thank you. The second amendment, oh, hold on, which I think is on, no, that's Dan's. It's on the red? No. Yeah, it's on like the pinky red.
It's the rose colour.
Yeah. It relates to placing a restriction on the, I guess, the extent to which eatlets could be implemented under this policy.
Is there a seconder for the amendment? Seconded by Councillor Castle.
Thank you. I don't have an issue with moving from like a temporary parklet to more permanent parklets, and I have been supportive of when we have had businesses that have come forward that have had existing parklets that have operated successfully near their businesses, and they've requested additional, I guess, an amendment to their tenure to be able to facilitate licensing. So I don't have an issue with that being considered on a case-by-case basis. However, this policy ultimately, the way it's written, seeks to perhaps provide a bit too much of a leeway, and again doesn't provide any direction at the policy level for administration to understand the extent to which these provisions should be implemented. I think that it's appropriate to implement these restrictions, and so this policy seeks to put a 400-metre radius around and a percentage associated with how many eatlets can be in place. I think, look, you could say that an eatlet is just a bit like an alfresco area and it's on a footpath adjacent to a business. However, the city is unlikely to seek to develop the areas like directly outside of business, but we could absolutely choose to develop a wide verge or a roadway. So passing this policy without ensuring that there are adequate checks and balances in place to allow for the limitation of some of the policy provisions, to allow for rollback or restorations, means that we could really be seen to be effectively greenlighting the permanent loss of public space. That space that could be used for greening, for public art, for bike paths, wider pedestrian zones, bikes, or e-rideable parking. There's a big difference between an alfresco area, which is effectively a few chairs and tables on the footpath, and an eatlet. However, even with a few chairs and tables, we know that strong bonds are forged when a commercial operation makes their living in the public space. One of my greatest concerns with this policy is that it doesn't adequately consider the challenges associated with rolling back access, and it doesn't place any, I think, meaningful restrictions on the privatisation of the public realm. Try telling a business that you're going to reduce their licensed seating area to plant trees, install play equipment, or create a wider shared path. The benefit of the eatlet resides primarily with the business and its customers, whilst the opportunity cost is borne by the community more broadly. Now, I know that our businesses and their customers are also drawn from Vincent, but we have to recognise that this policy, whilst it is called the Vibrant Public Spaces Policy, many of its provisions really relate to the commercialise the public space policy, and there's a limitation to which I'm happy to accept that. I think the other issue is that this policy, I think, will effectively see the loss of the parklet. There's a disincentive created for businesses here. Parklets offer a way bigger public benefit, but they're kind of treated the same way as eatlets. My preference is really to have parklets, and then the city consider applications for licence on an individual basis once a parklet's been operating for a period of time. So, I mean, ultimately, I think that that would be my preference in the overarching policy, and I'm really yet to determine if my hand's going in the air for the substantive. So this amendment is really looking at providing some safety net. But I do think once you let the cat out of the bag with this one, there's no getting it back in. So I have some concerns more broadly. I also note that the intention is for eatlet applications to be approved under delegated authority, and I don't really agree with that either. I don't think it's transparent enough. And so again, I would prefer that we saw these issues dealt with on a case-by-case basis with appropriate levels of public engagement and consideration.
Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I am supportive of this amendment. I have some of the same concerns as Councillor Gontaszewski about getting that balance right between public and private space. And I think in the example of eatlets, what we're seeing is a move towards much more exclusive use. I agree that on my current reading of the policy, I don't know why anyone would apply for a parklet when they can apply for an eatlet. It's the same fee and they get more exclusive use. So there's really no reason not to go for that. So I do think this amendment goes some of the way towards keeping a lid on that. I have a question around the numbers because I note that administration doesn't support it, and I just wonder, is that position that administration does not support any limitation, or that there's an issue with either the 400 metre catchment or the 20% figure?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it's that administration wouldn't support a limit on the eatlets, as we see that they would be benefiting the public realm. And although, yes, they would not be accessible to those that are not visiting the business within business hours, they would be accessible out of those hours. So that investment in the public realm is what we would like to support. So we were not supporting the limit of them. We proposed the percentage and the radius model, as we thought that would be a good way of being able to measure it in order to achieve the objectives that have been discussed.
So would it be right that if there is going to be a limit, that administration's comfortable with this area and the 20% cap? That's a manageable number for you to administer?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it would be a manageable number for us to administer and for us to manage, I suppose, that level of applications and going through those processes. Yes.
And would it be right that if this was part of the policy, that if any particular 400 metre catchment, which is likely to be a town centre, reaches that 20% threshold, then beyond that, businesses would still be able to apply for a parklet, they just would not be able to have an eatlet at that point?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Look, I agree. I can completely see the intent of the policy, and I think that there is a community benefit to the development of parklets and eatlets. However, in introducing this two-tiered approach, which we haven't seen before, I think we really need to be mindful about what the difference between those different types of license and fee structure means. So to set up two different categories and yet not distinguish between them in any meaningful way really leaves us open to, or really doesn't give us the same control that I think that we need in this situation. I think that this is something too that could well be reviewed when it's in practice. If we see that we're consistently reaching that 20% threshold and the feeling of a town centre, for example, is that there's scope for more development in parklets and eatlets, then that's a number that I think we could review. But given the numbers that are contained in the reason for the report, that leaderpool currently sits at 8.3, I think 20% is probably still quite generous, given that's probably the highest concentration of parklets that we currently have in any of our town centres. So I'm comfortable supporting it for now as an amendment for this policy. And if in future reviews of the policy, there's a proposal that based on the experience that those numbers need some adjusting, then that's something that we can review at that time.
Thank you, Councillor Castle. Just sort of piggybacking off that, I was just looking at, because we do have a number in the briefing notes, got a number of what would already sort of be deemed eatlet under the policy. So we've got Pinchos, Roberts on Oxford, Kitch, Just Burgers, Fibber McGee's. It does sort of go up to to Pixel, but Manager, I'm not sure, did you have a sort of assessment of what 20% might look like, even just in Leaderville? I know I'm sort of putting you on the spot here, but does it still allow, do you think it still allows capacity for further eatlets within Leaderville? Because that's where we have the concentration on at this point.
To you, Mayor Cole, absolutely it does. That was, I suppose, Leaderville because, as you say, it is the most concentrated area of existing what we would now call eatlets if this policy was approved, was the area that we chose to measure to determine kind of a percentage that we would recommend, and therefore we would be able to see a increase in eatlets to what is existing, which would change the landscape and would continue the eatlets within that area, which is already the most existing area of eatlets prominent in Vincent.
So if this amendment is successful, then there would still be capacity for further eatlets in Leederville, and you could sort of potentially see what that looks like, and then council could consider taking that next step forward if there was more confidence in how the eatlets were progressing and working. When would this policy be due for review?
To you, Mayor Cole, on just the first point, yes, because currently we have 8.3% of the public realm in Leederville in that 400 metre catchment. So we'd see more than a double. The review of policy would be due in, I believe, 4 years' time, but let me just check that.
Right.
Nicole, that would be correct, but we could also change that if we wanted to, for it to be due at a different time if council was of that view.
Sorry, just to clarify that, did you say 1 year?
Nicole, I said 4 years.
Oh, 4 years. Okay. It would be interesting to review the impact of eatlets after a shorter time frame if the amendment flies. So I might just get through this, and perhaps that might be something we consider. Thank you, Manager. Over to Councillor Iapolo.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm supportive of Councillor Gonczewski's amendment, but I'm just questioning whether it would actually ever apply, because when I look at the definition of public realm, it says means all public spaces, including thoroughfare and streets, public car parks, reserves, public open spaces, civic squares and other areas used and accessible to the community. So I don't know how we would ever get to anywhere near 20%. I mean, I don't even think we would ever get to 5% or 2%, because you have to include, if you look at Leederville, you've got to include whilst the car parks are in our ownership, you would include both big major car parks in that area space. You would include Oxford Street, Newcastle Street within a 400 metre radius. You would include probably parts of Leederville Oval. I don't think you'd get 1%. I mean, I guess talking to Councillor Gonczewski's point, and I agree with what she's trying to achieve, but I don't think this would be an effective policy, because you would never, I can't conceivably, you would never get close to 20% if it includes roads. And can I get administration's confirmation of that opinion?
Yep, Manager, I think you just said 8.9% coverage already in Leederville as an indication of, yeah.
Nicole, yeah, it was 8.3%. 8.3%. That was measured from the intersection of Oxford Street and Newcastle Street within a 400 metre radius of that point.
And could I clarify, would that include you've included the parking lots and Leederville Oval in that? So you're dividing the total area of the eatlets divided by the public open space, which includes the roads, the parking lots, Leederville Oval, because that'd all be within 400 metres.
Well, the previous amendment has removed public open space, so that's been removed.
I missed that. Okay.
But I'll go back to the manager, because the calculation is that it's not, it's already at 8.3%. So there's obviously been a measurement. So perhaps you could talk us through how you measured that.
Yes, through you, Mayor Cole. That's right. It is. We got the 8.3% by looking at all of the spaces where an eatlet would be permissible through this policy. So looking at, we were taking the road portions that could have them as an eatlet. So noting that, of course, the road spaces that are being used for traffic were not included in that. In that calculation, it was just the spaces where, as per the policy, an eatlet could be approved. So looking at that total area, dividing that, and looking at the percentage of the area that currently has what would be an eatlet through this policy. Some of those examples are within the briefing notes, and that currently sits at 8.3%. So we looked at the area which would be allowed to have an eatlet as through this policy, the best spot probably to look at that is within the table 1 of the location permissibility within the policy itself.
So to clarify, that's not the existing position, that's potential if we allowed infinite number of every possible space. So the number at the moment might be like 1% of existing eatlets to the space, if I'm understanding correctly. But also my second question is, could you just confirm you've included all the parking lots and Leederville Oval in that as the total area of, sorry, it's parks, public open space. I don't know if public open space is reserves, but roads and public car parks for sure. Just to confirm that that was included in your 8%.
Through you, Mayor Cole, just to clarify that first point, it is 8.3%. Looks at the current eatlets. If this policy was to go through, the 8.3% looks at refers to the current spaces that we have, which would be transitioned into eatlets. The space in which we looked at getting that percentage from was the spaces in which eatlets would be permitted under this policy. So that looks at the built form areas of the town centre, the activity corridor, mixed use, and then permitted where located adjacent to an existing or approved business in the kind of transit corridor or residential areas. So it is the areas in which it would be permitted under this policy, so that if this policy was in effect, of that area, it would be then allowed to be 20% of that area. Currently, if this policy became in effect, we would already, with the structures or the spaces that we have in play at the moment, come up to that 8.3%. So we would already be that ways to that 20% threshold.
So just a point of clarity, I think your 8% is, if I'm understanding you correctly, Tara, the 8% is the existing eatlets divided by the potential for eatlets to qualify in spaces. And you're saying that that number right now would be 8%. But I think the denominator, per how the amendment is written, refers to public realm specifically, and that public realm actually includes a lot more space that is possible, even though current policy wouldn't allow you to put it there. So I think the 8% is a wrong calculation based on how this is drafted because of the inclusion of the definition of public realm. Do you want me to explain that?
Through you, Mayor Cole, just to clarify, some of the spaces that you've mentioned, such as the car parks, like they're not included because they're not located adjacent to a existing business. So that is not permitted under this policy. So it's just the areas. We only took the areas of, I suppose, the public realm, which would be permitted for this policy. So such as the reserve and public open space. As you can see, if we were looking at table 1, which is on page 5 of the policy, the eatlet is not permitted in a reserve or a public open space. So that was not considered. So if we put the amendment previously aside, that was really only for those other proposals. But if we're looking at the eatlet itself, that was never proposed to be permitted in that area. So we were looking at the area in which would be permitted through this policy, and then taking a percentage of that area.
Okay,
if that answers your question.
It does, and I just think that the way that Councillor Gontichevsky has drafted that amendment, that's not what that amendment's saying. That amendment is saying within a 400-metre catchment or radius, no more than 20% of the public realm, and public realm is defined as all those things. So I think maybe what her intention was that it should have been worded as no more than 20% of the public realm of areas that would be eligible under our policy, rather than 20% of the public realm, which would include streets, car parks, places where we would never conceive that an eatlet would be placed. But the way this is drafted, I think that you would never get close to 20%.
Can I make a suggestion, Councillor Uplow? We can deal with this amendment, and then if you would like, you could potentially move another amendment to amend the words to say 20% of the public realm of eligible areas. Yep. Okay, well, everyone comfortable with what we're dealing with as part of this amendment, with a potential clarifying, sorry, I'll take it off again. Clarification coming forward in the potential foreshadowed amendment. Any further comments on this amendment? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Back to the substantive motion. Are there any further comments or amendments? Councillor Iapolo.
Yes. So after the words proposing an amendment, after recommendation 1, where is it? No, after the words no more than 20% of the public realm, insert the words that would be eligible areas.
Could you just simply say of eligible areas?
But it has to be under the policy, doesn't it?
Well, the whole motion is about the policy, so I think that's sufficient.
Okay.
But I'll
20% of
manager of executive governance with the wording of eligible areas satisfy that that was relevant to the policy that we're adopting for advertising.
I believe so.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, so we have an amendment to insert the words of eligible areas, just to provide that clarification. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Gontaszewski. Any discussion? Okay, I'll move it. All those in favour? I declare that carried. We're back to the substantive. Any further comments? Councillor Gontaszewski.
I'll just speak to it. I think I had one question that I forgot to ask last week at the briefing, and it just related to parking. In the policy, it talks to a parklet or an eatlet only being appropriate if the parking threshold doesn't exceed 85%. And I just wanted to find out like the way that would be measured, like you count the cars over a course of a whole day, again, a bit like the amendment that Councillor Iapolo put forward, which I was thankful for because I think it was a good one. It's to do with the denominator. What's the denominator and the numerator in your 85% calculation in relation to parking?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I believe that the parking surveys are done at different times of the day, at different times of the week, to kind of get a good coverage of what parking is happening in that space. And it would be averaging that to ensure that the capacity of that car parking area doesn't exceed that 85%.
And so an applicant that potentially did used a different methodology or took a parking, like they put their application in on the basis of one calculation, would the city be redoing the parking assessment as part of their consideration?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it would be based on our occupancy surveys, the city's.
Okay, and so the intention is essentially it's like looking at the overall average rather than, for example, saying that if parking in that area exceeds 85% at any time, that a parklet or an eatlet wouldn't be appropriate.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. It's the average occupancy of the surveys that we had taken, the most up to date, I suppose, project. You know, if the rangers were to say we're going to go out and measure the occupancy and put together a plan of times of the day and when that would be, then that would conclude, and then we would have the average occupancy based on those surveys, putting those together.
And just also on food and beverage operations within town centres, obviously a lot of them have development approvals that might limit hours, but if you're doing, what's the general permissible hours of operation for a food and beverage business within a town centre? Is there limitations on that, or can it be 24/7?
Through you, Mayor Cole, the eatlet or the parklet associated with the business would take the approved business hours in which are already approved, this would not be a mechanism to change those hours.
But for a new business or, I guess going forwards, if we have something that was a shop and is now a bar or whatever, you know, change of use?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes. So if they were to go through that change of use and look at changing their hours or extending their hours, then, and they had an existing parklet or an eatlet, it would also, those business hours associated with the business and I suppose the space would then be updated or reflected of that. So if the business got their hours approved to be extended by 2 hours, then those business operating hours of that parklet or eatlet would be extended in the same way. It would always mirror the approved business hours of that business.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one of I have some concerns about this policy quite clearly. I don't have an issue with moving from temporary parklets to more permanent parklets. And I think in some ways that was one of the drivers for this policy, and looking at some of those, you know, discussions around sort of more permanent infrastructure around seating and umbrellas, etc., having a more streamlined process for that. I'm concerned about privatising the public realm, and I think if reading through the detailed responses to the consultation, I think that there was some concerns that came forward in relation to this, a bit of an undercurrent of preference for public. What are the controls in place on private? And one of the questions was, what happens when temporary in nature development needs to be removed if they become much loved community features but impede a larger purpose? And I guess to that, I would also add, if they become essential components of the commercial viability of the business that's adjacent but impede a larger purpose. And the city's response in that consultation was this. It said, the city has a number of alternative options for businesses, community groups and residents to engage with city land. Should a development need to be removed, opportunity will be explored to provide similar service in another format if deemed appropriate by the city as the issue arises. And I don't think that response really cuts it for me. And I don't think that the policy as it's written makes clear that effectively all private, privatisation on the public land should be considered temporary in nature. I don't also accept this idea that a private eatlet is, it provides a public benefit outside the times of use of that business. In general terms, you see businesses, they operate when their area is busy. And so there's an incentive for them to stay open if their area is busy. And so, we look at this idea that the current veranda area of the Elford is somehow a public and a private space. It's just not, and we need to own that. So I'm keen to understand from the city, if we go out to consultation as this stands, how the city intends to elicit community sentiment in relation to a parklet versus an eatlet, and what a resident might lose the opportunity to have if we see the proliferation of private business in the public realm.
Through you, Matt Cole. Yes, going back to the initial engagement that was done, absolutely, there was a sentiment to ensure that these spaces are not privatised or seen to be privatised. I think that the consultation that we will go through, if this policy is approved for advertising, would be to really understand more what that looks like. There was a lot of comments around the design of the structures. Is it the fact that the public feels that even when these structures are parklets, not deemed as what's eatlets in this current policy, or are eatlets but are outside business hours, I think it will be very important through this consultation to make sure that although they are able to be used by the public, making sure that people feel that they can be in those spaces from a design perspective. So that will be, I guess, a big part, but then that will leave the part that, okay, if we get that right, if we have the design that makes it welcoming and we have the signage that makes people understand that they are able to be here, does the community see that that's enough, that some of these spaces as eatlets would only be accessible after business hours? Do people see that they want to sit in a space on a Sunday when the business may be closed, or after it's open or before it's open? So I think it will be really around understanding when the public has concerns over it being utilised by the public, is that due to the hours that the eatlet would restrict, because it would not be accessible during those business hours, similar to your alfresco at the moment, or would it be the fact that they don't see it as accessible at all through the design? So I think that would be a big part, noting that some of the examples, I suppose, that we see there at the moment would not be approved through this policy from a design perspective. So perhaps that would change the public's perception of that space.
I guess the other thing I'm keen to understand is how administration or whether administration intends to consult around that potential of the opportunity cost, in the sense that if, obviously people are aware that an eatlet or a parklet potentially goes on a carve, right, or a verge. And I guess the question that I have is whether the city will be seeking to engage with the community about other mechanisms by which we could have vibrant and welcoming public spaces that potentially haven't been covered off in this policy, recognising that this policy has a specific scope and intent, but in the sense that the preference of the community, are they really looking for more outdoor dining options? And look, in WA, like, I get it, we've got sunshine all the time. So, that's outdoor dining is a wonderful thing, but are they really looking for outdoor dining options in their town centres? Or are they looking for public seating? Are they looking for shade? Are they looking for bike and e-rideable parking? Are they looking for wider pedestrian thoroughfares that aren't so cluttered with signage, etc.? Are they looking for public art or play equipment? And I'm not sure that really to date the scope of the consultation has gathered that. And I guess I'd like to get some understanding as to whether it's intended that that we're going to actually raise some of those questions with the community to get a sense of whether there's a desire to have more outdoor dining options, if that potentially means that the options for those other things will be harder to achieve.
Yeah, through you, Michael, absolutely. I think that the main way we would have been intending to measure that is through those design objectives. So we have drafted them based on that initial consultation of what people see as value or what people want to see in these spaces. But if we go out to consultation and we hear that any one of those, I suppose, pieces of amenity or design aspects or locational aspects are seen as something of high value, then that would be something that we would then put into those objectives, whether it's from a design perspective or a locational perspective or a amenity perspective, that you must provide kind of X amenity, whether it's, seating for this many people or any of the items that you've mentioned. We would ensure that that was within the objectives of the vibrant public space type, so that if we received an application that did not meet those amenities and did not meet, I suppose, what we've heard that the community values, then they would not be able to be, they would not progress because they were unable to meet those objectives. So we're seeing that the objectives and the detail and the clarity of those is a really important part to get through this community consultation, because that will be our way of determining whether the application is successful to go through. Another thing to note that we will definitely be engaging with through this community engagement process, if approved, would be that fee structure. So when it comes to what amenities people value, therefore what do they also, I suppose, not see a value in, and therefore we need to reflect that in the fees. So if the public really sees a huge value in something, then does that, such as a parklet, does that mean that the fee for that needs to be lower to enable those to be, for us to see more of those? So that's something that we will definitely be also engaging with the community on, is those fees and have we got those right?
Can you also just confirm for me, this item or the discussion of this potential policy came to council in June 2021? Did it come to any council workshop it was discussed? Was it on the agenda of any other workshop or is it just been since then?
Through you, Mayor Cole, I believe that was the last workshop where we talked about that initial consultation with the draft circulated electronically, not via workshop.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I just don't know if I think I can support this. I have some concerns about letting something out for consultation and then having a consultation that I think potentially isn't going to ask the questions in the way that I think they need to be asked. The key question here, I think, isn't what design objectives do you want from a privatisation of the public realm initiative? The key question is, do we want to see increased privatisation of the public realm in the City of Vincent? And I looked back to the workshop papers from June and I've read the consultation responses to date, and I'm still not really seeing that there is a strong community sentiment that sees the benefit of something like an eatlet over a parklet implemented in any sort of at a policy level as opposed to sort of a bespoke or one-off level. I just don't really see that there is a strong driver for it. As I said, I think there's an opportunity cost that comes from allowing businesses to privatise the public realm, and I understand that because it does affect the commercial viability and the saleability of their business if we need to roll back or if for a variety of reasons. And I'm not sure that I'm really satisfied that that we have the driver, and I also am not sure that we have then the controls. So I would probably prefer that this was something that was not sent out to consultation. I do note that in the June papers, there was no concept of an eatlet. As I said, the discussions primarily to date have been really around how we would look at transitioning potential existing parklets to more permanent parklets and some of those things. So this is a concept that is new, and I don't think I'm quite ready to let it out for consultation because I wouldn't want to feel that we had a consultation that wasn't right. I didn't answer the questions and then we were accused of not listening to that consultation. So I won't be supporting this item.
That was pretty epic, Councillor Gondaszewski. Almost had to call you to time there. This is a very interesting discussion, and I think one of the critical elements you're highlighting is that the consultation really, really strongly needs to emphasise the eatlet, because that's the significant change in the policy. So the consultation must highlight that and go to that very point, because that's really the key issue here. I think for me, the fee structure and the make good provisions, I'm still a little bit unsure about. I'm just wondering when we talk about the fact that the fee will go towards making good, that could be many years later. So is it going to be treated like a bond that we'd take when we, someone cracks their right of way or damages a tree? How will that be managed? And there's certainly the issue that we find about ownership and a sense of turf, and I think we experience that in local government, and we do need to understand that and that can happen. We've seen when people have had to move parklets for roadworks, that's caused a lot of issues for the business. So I think we do really need to be very eyes wide open to that. But then, when I was really thinking about this, I was taking us back to the journey of Vincent and how we've treated these places. So for me, I went back to al fresco. So in Vincent, we made the decision that al fresco, we'd make it free. That is effectively a business using their adjoining public open space to have tables and chairs. We made it free. We put in a system to make it really easy to get that permit. We then looked at adding parklets to the roads as a way of sort of extending that. So this is like the next iteration, and it's almost like taking an al fresco area and giving it a bit of a structure. So I came back to that principle and I thought that for me seems okay. And there's a bit of a progression here that Vincent's been following. And I totally take the point that this is really about leveraging investment. And when I think about Leaderville, when you come down Oxford Street and you see people, you know, sitting at Pixel, might be different times of day, it's not all happening at the same time, but people with their dogs sitting at the parklet, having coffee, having chats, and you go down and you see people at Roberts, they're always out. Robert's always out the front chatting to people inside the bar at the parklet. It creates this real vibrancy on the street. And then you go into Leaderville Town Centre, and that Pinchos parklet really creates energy on that corner. It creates an absolute presence. So I get it. And I think that where we've actually seen that transition of parklets, where we tried to put them in as public spaces and we put them outside of places that didn't, you know, that wasn't attached to a business, they really just didn't work. So there is this absolute connection between business and energy and vibrancy on the street. So overall, like, I think you've done a really great job policy in place. And I think there's a lot of thought that's gone into this. And I think it is the next iteration for Vincent. So I'm quite positive and embracing of what you're putting forward. But I think the essential thing for me is that the public consultation, because what we're doing tonight is we're not adopting this strategy. We're saying we're taking it out to public consultation for their feedback. So for me, the critical thing is that we really have to understand how the community feels about eatlets, that it is a change, that, you know, it does have some impact on public space. We put in some parameters around 20%. I don't think we need to cause a review of the entire policy earlier than 4 years, but perhaps we need to think about from here, and then when it comes back from advertising, how do we look at where we're at with parklets at 20%? How does that feel? What are the impacts? Is that as far as we go? But I think that, you know, Councillor Gontaszewski's put in place some good measures to sort of try to keep this a bit more contained. But overall, I feel pretty positive about it, and I'm really wanting to test this, but I think the consultation is absolutely critical. Councillors, any comments? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? I might have a split here, so I'll just count hands. So that's Councillor Warner, Councillor Loden, Councillor Castle, Councillor Wallace, Councillor Alexander, myself and Councillor Iopolo. Those against? Councillor Hallett and Councillor Gontaszewski. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Manager. Oh, that's right. Okay, that concludes strategy and development for the evening. So moving to infrastructure and environment, and we have item 10.1. It was a late item. Notice that wasn't noted on the agenda, and we are quite fastidious about, we do like to, you know, be clear on these things. Yep, so item 10.1, asset management and sustainability strategy, asset prioritisation, buildings implementation plan. Can I have a mover and seconder? Moved by Councillor Gontaszewski, seconded by Councillor Iopolo.
Thank you. I have an amendment, so I'll let the seconder speak if they wish.
Councillor Iopolo.
Just a question. So what is being received here is the project plan, but when we refer back to the original meeting in November, there was 2 or 3 items that were being requested to report back to council on. So are we, just for clarity, are we only receiving one of 3 parts of which was originally requested in November?
So through you, McCall, I can answer that. So Councillor Opera is correct. Back in November, there were 3 parts, I think. They were reported to a December council, and this report is a result of an additional resolution that was added in December. So I think all the things, both in the November and December council requests, have now been achieved.
So I just wanted to clarify. So the project plan for the sports and recreational facilities plan has already been received. Is that just confirming?
Yeah, through you, McCall, that's correct. That was received on, I think it's mentioned in the report, on the 14th of December. That was provided to council.
Councillors, any questions? Director, I did have a question because I just wondered, like, a lot of the stuff that's on the project milestones, I'm assuming that there's already bodies of work that have been done. For example, we have looked at levels of service previously with the Lycopodium review that happened. There's talk about building inspections, and some of it does say updating, but I'm assuming that when, you know, some of this sort of suggests that there's this, you know, stuff that that we really have already, you know, done.
Michael, some of that work, I mean, the Lycopodium work is more than 5 years old now, I think, from recollection. It's even before my time at the city. So we're certainly carrying out updated inspections. So we're not ignoring things like what was done in the past, like what Lycopodium did, but we're certainly carrying out new inspections of all the buildings. In fact, they're already underway. You can see that we started in January and February. So some of that work's already underway.
So would you say, it does talk about consolidate and update. Some says undertake, but, you know, I'm assuming that this is just kind of a refresh on things like building inspections and, as I say, levels of service. I mean, I was here 5 years ago. It doesn't seem like that long to me, but I'm sure it was.
Sorry, Michael. So yeah, I suppose to summarize, we are using what we already have and updating it by carrying out some more inspections, which are already underway.
Thank you. Councillors, Councillor Gontaszewski.
Thank you. I'd like to propose an amendment to add a point 2 to request the Chief Executive Officer amend the project plan and list the AMSS Asset Prioritisation Plan for buildings and level of service review for discussion at the April and August 2022 Council workshops.
Both workshops. Okay. Is there a seconder for the amendment? Seconded by Councillor Loden.
The reason that I'm putting forward this amendment is, because I've been here for more than 5 years. So I remember the last time we had a workshop about levels of service, and it led to nothing. And I think that, what it really led to is maybe that we needed an asset management strategy more broadly, but it wasn't a discussion that I felt provided any really strong grounding for administration to actually go and undertake the work. My concern with the current project plan is that level of service review is quite late in the piece. I also feel that the asset prioritisation plan for buildings should also benefit from early council engagement. And so I feel that we should be discussing it in council workshop, have the opportunity to discuss informally before something comes for council consideration. As it's quite late in the process, that it is likely that we would see this again, and it's an item that could have quite significant impacts on council's ability to achieve the objectives of our asset management and sustainability strategy.
Councillor Loden.
I agree, basically.
Okay, great. Councillors, any questions or comments on the amendment proposed? Okay, I'll put the amendment. All those in favour? All those against? I know, all in favour, thank you. No one against. Back to the substantive. Are there any further comments or questions? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? I declare that carried. Moving now to Community and Business Services, 11.4, Mid-Year Budget Review 21-22. This is an absolute majority decision. Welcome, Director of Business and Community. Can I have a mover and seconder for this item, please? Moved by Councillor Iopolo, seconded by Councillor Gontaszewski.
Thank you, Mayor. So this is there's a lot in here, and just for those watching at home, there has been, a lot of dialogue, communication going back and forward between myself and administration in relation to various aspects of this item, and I just want to give I'm predominantly happy with all those responses, but I thought it's worth it because to actually table some of the responses and give administration the opportunity to confirm the understanding from that correspondence, really more for the benefit of the public. But I do wish to also flag an amendment to this item.
I'll just have to go to the seconder before the
Sorry.
amendment. Councillor Gondaszewski.
No, nothing from me.
Okay, back to you, Councillor Iplow.
Thank you. So just pull up my notes. So just talking to the substantive. So there's a little bit to unpack, but I guess just the first point I wanted to make was in relation to.
Councillor Iplow, you already have spoken as the mover to the substantive, so you will need to move your amendment now.
Amendment now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because otherwise you'll be speaking twice.
Okay, sure. So the amendment has been circulated. So
Yep, the amendment on the white with the orange border. Is there a seconder for the amendment, please? Seconded by Councillor Gondaszewski. Go ahead, Councillor Iplow.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay. So the net decrease in capital expenditure budget of 7 million. I guess the amendment that I'm proposing is to just provide more transparency around that. So there's a clarification on this. 6.8 million of the 7.1 is going to be deferred and carry forward to the FY23 year, which administration has advised that this reflects revised delivery timeframes and timing of grant allocations. 325,000 of which would be deferred and carry forward to FY24 for similar reasons. And that 564,000 or thereabouts of capital expenditure, which effectively represents overspend, would be covered by a reduction of an equivalent amount from over budget. So what we're effectively being asked here is roughly $500,000 have been overspent on various capital expenditures, or is anticipated to be going over budget. And what we're doing is moving or covering the potential or probable overspend on these items with other capital projects which we are recognising as have been over budgeted. So we're basically covering off a potential overspend on certain CapEx items with an over budget on other CapEx items. And the nature of the amendment is to just provide a bit more transparency on what we're doing. And on these points, I just wanted to confirm that a couple of things, that in relation to the potential overspend on certain CapEx items to the quantum of $564,000, to confirm with administration that the overspend is authorised and within the delegated authority of administration in relation to those items.
So through you, Mayor Cole, I'll just respond to that comment. So where we're talking about overspend, it's where we've got individual projects where we believe that it's going to, we're going to need further budget to complete that project. There's a couple of reasons why that might happen. We estimate the budget more than a year prior. So it could be that by the time we get to actually go out to tender, that the market rates are different to what we expected. Or it could be that in the delivery of the project, there are unexpected outcomes that occur in delivering that project. But I should also note that 300,000 of that 564,000 relates to the Britannia Reserve floodlights, which was actually approved by council at our February OCM meeting. So 300 of the 564 is already been approved by council. So when we're talking about authorisations, that is a provision that has been identified, and we have identified a corresponding 300,000 in other projects where we believe we can either save those funds or, effectively we can save those funds from existing projects. So the remaining, the team have gone through the process of identifying other projects where savings have already been made or where they can deliver savings in order to bring the projects back into alignment and bring the budget back into alignment.
So just thank you for that explanation. I just want to clarify succinctly that it's permissible for administration to apply
Thank you.
Yep, an overspend on some items and use a budget allocation or an over budget on other items, and that's permissible under its delegated authority, or is this
correct?
Specifically require council approval?
Thanks for rounding that out. Yeah, so I did mention to Councillor Alpolo that if a particular project has blown its budget or it's required more funds, the CEO or the director can actually approve those additional funds, but within parameters relating to their delegated authority. So on a project by project basis, that has been authorised.
And just to probably fill that out a bit more, that's subject to delegations and subject to the project management framework that we've been discussing in terms of how far do those delegations extend and what additional budget does council allow that delegation to extend to. So we have been having those discussions recently. Thanks,
Mayor Cole. Yes.
I just think that was important so that the public understand that, you know, that's all part of the process. In relation to the 6.8 million of CapEx that we're deferring to FY23, I just want to confirm with administration that as we defer the significant portion of CapEx, that the numbers, what we're increasing in reserves, so this amount is either going into reserves or you are reducing what's it called? The grants, the grants number, which is, I think, driving your 1.9 million net increase in operating budget. So if we combine what is going back into reserves for the future spend and the adjustment to the item non-operating grant subsidies and contributions in the statement of comprehensive income, that the combined change that we're proposing would loosely agree to the CapEx that is being deferred. I just want clarification on that.
Yeah, so through you, Mayor Cole, I can confirm that, and a specific breakdown of the source funding is shown at Appendix 6, and that indicates where we have effectively reversed out these projects, where the money then reverts to. So if we were, say, for example, drawing from our reserves to pay for a project and now that project has been deferred, then what we're doing is we're now allocating that money back into reserve. So we no longer need it because the project is going to be occurring in the following year. And a summary of all of those movements in and out is in Appendix 6 of the agenda paper.
Okay, great. Thank you for the clarification. My last point is just in relation to the idea that we're deferring such a large amount of CapEx, 6.8 million to future years, that, you know, there is some area of concern on this, in a sense that what we're doing is we're effectively, through the rate setting process, we're ensuring we are raising this money to spend as part of that process. But where you've got such material over budgets, so what we're effectively doing is raising money ahead of time before we spend it. And I guess that can have some adverse implications for ratepayers, in the sense that they're paying well ahead of when we actually spend the money. So this is something that I guess on an ongoing basis I wouldn't be supporting. But at the same time, you know, I recognise that it's great to go through a process where we're going on a line-by-line basis and identifying for every single capital project where we've got potential overspend or over budget, and we're doing the right thing here by, you know, acknowledging that we aren't going to spend the money and moving that effectively into reserves. So I agree with it, but I guess going forward, in the vein of continuous improvement in the way that we, are held to account, that we wouldn't want a situation going forward where we have such material over budgets on CapEx because of the timing issue. We should be raising money as and when needed, unless we are specifically raising a reserve for a long-term project that we know is going to be kind of executed over a number of future years. So really just flagging it for, I guess, more for us internally on the budget process as we embark on it for FY23, that wherever possible, we wouldn't want such a material over budget, and we would want to be a bit more accurate about what we would spend or likely to spend in the oncoming 12-month period, so as not to, raise too much money too early. But other than that, I've been happy with the responses offline and in this forum. Thank you.
Through you, Mayor Cole, if I could just make an additional comment in response to that. Where we're talking about deferring, roughly $7 million in projects, there's actually some fairly sizable projects in there and sizable grants. So,
yes.
So for example, the Litter Stadium works, there's about $3 million worth of grant funding. So it's important as we're discussing this to understand that this is not money that has been funded by ratepayers, that's been funded by the federal government. And what we're doing is we're aligning the budgeting to the timeframes where the actual works are likely to occur and when the grant is likely to be received. So sometimes we're not clear as to when that's going to occur. There's another $500,000 in those allocations that are from third parties who are, perhaps other organisations who are contributing money towards a project. And so there are a number of different ways that these projects are being funded, and we are very conscious of the demands that we place on our ratepayers, and we remain mindful of that as well.
Director, on that a question in relation to, because all of this information is in the capital budget mid-year review spreadsheet, which is sort of on page 11 of the individual item onwards.
Correct.
So I was interested in the difference between grant and municipal funding. Some of the comments go to that, but it would probably be useful to have it have a column to state what components grant funding and what component is municipal.
Yeah. And
then maybe we would have to have a much more immediate and clear understanding of what component of the 6.8 million is grant funding, of which we know at least 3 million is Britannia, but then you have to go through the notes to then,
So Mayor Cole, if I can refer you to my page 17 of that report, that does provide a little bit of that breakdown, perhaps not to the extent that you're mentioning, but it does talk about, as I said, there's the $6.8 million, but I think on my page, it looks like about, I've just got to expand it up a little bit, almost $4 million of that relates to grants, and $512,000 of that relates to third-party contributions. So that does give a little bit of indication of where the funds are actually being sourced from for those corresponding projects.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Councillor Gontaszewski, as a seconder, would you like to speak to this motion?
Just to say that I appreciated the report. I think that this is part of our maturity in this space, and I've raised some questions around some of the way we've done our mid-year budget reviews previously, but this was pretty seamless for me, so thank you very much.
Thank
you. Any other comments? That was intended to be a question before, so I just wanted to briefly comment that I think, Councillor Apollo, you're raising an important point around capacity. So we've got we've got the grant funding and all the rest of it and those sorts of things, but we also do have to be mindful of what is our capacity to deliver. But yes, there's a lot of what you've done here is a good summary. I did read that within the capital works breakdown, and that document was incredibly useful. And just to reiterate on those points, that 300,000 of the 589 was approved by council at on the Britannia Reserve lighting. We had that discussion around, why is this so much less and why is this so much more? And we've been probing those sorts of questions because we're trying to get on top of budgeting and forecasting our costs. And even when we've had a quantity surveyor involved, it still has led to issues in this climate. And it's also really going to that issue of the project management framework and the discussion we had around what level of delegations and whether we were comfortable to have both contingency and then scope for administration to approve more, and council said no, we're not comfortable with that. So we have actually tried to really tighten that up. So we are putting controls in place and asking the right questions. And I think for next budget, when we're setting our capital works program, we have to be very conscious of capacity. So great that you bring this forward. Thank you, Councillor Opolo. Any further comments or questions? Okay, we'll put the motion. All those in favour? That's passed. Sorry, was that sorry, I've just lost track. Was that the amendment?
The amendment.
That was the amendment. So I'll just call it again, just so I'm clear that we're actually voting on Councillor Opolo's amendment. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. We're back to the substantive. Are there any further comments on the substantive motion? Okay, I'll put that. All those in favour? Declare that carried unanimously. Okay, our next CEO items, we have 12.1, appointment of community members to the City of Vincent Audit Committee, another absolute majority decision. So can I have a mover and seconder for this item, please? Moved by Councillor Iopolo, seconded by Councillor Wallace. Thank you. Wish to speak to the motion?
Yeah, so I guess the audit committee met and discussed this at length, and the two proposed candidates that have been put forward as our recommendations were, debated at length, and rightly so, because it's an important part of the audit committee composition. And some of the relevant factors that you need to consider is, continuity in certain number of people, and also the recognition that also turnover is also good because you get fresh eyes on something. I think one of the key aspects for me as a chartered accountant was obviously trying to address a need within the committee that responds to some of the audit report of the Officer General. Specifically, I think a common problem across a lot of local government is IT related issues and risks. And I think the recommendation kind of reflects the importance of that, given the number of points that was raised in that audit report. So it was something that was discussed at length amongst the audit committee, and I guess that's the background for what we're proposing today.
Thank you, Councillor Iopolo. Councillor Wallace? Nothing further. Any further comments on the audit committee minutes? Okay. Oh, sorry, not the minutes, rather the appointment of community members. My apologies. Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Declare that carried unanimously. Takes us to item 12.6, undertakings relating to the Local Government Property Local Law 2021. I have a mover for this item, Councillor Gontaszewski, seconded by Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. This was another late item, and I just wanted to clarify that the or we just have an opportunity to ask some questions around the intentions going forward in relation to what's been raised around the smoking, the use of the word thoroughfares in our proposed local law, and where administration's at. I guess has the issue around utilising the word thoroughfares, but with a caveat that the term does not apply to smoking in a vehicle. Was that canvassed with the Joint Standing Committee, or is that something that's going to come forward in subsequent discussions?
Thank you. Through the chair. The second part I would suggest, the Joint Standing Committee generally doesn't give a great deal of notice in respect to their advice of their concerns with the local law. So we were having to work fairly hard to pull that report together. We have had initial contact with the Joint Standing Committee to get a feel from them whether they're just completely against the idea of a smoke-free town centre and the concept of smoke-free town centre, or whether there's some latitude for the city to be able to modify and amend the local law to be able to achieve the objectives that council has been trying to obtain. Their response from the Joint Standing Committee was to liaise with the Department of Local Government and work through them in respect to trying to achieve a suitable wording outcome, which may or may not involve the word, a clarification of the term thoroughfare, or perhaps look at talking about footpaths and verges. So we need to do that work through with the Department of Local Government. In council, should it choose to agree with the Joint Standing Committee's undertakings, the city will have 6 months to try to initiate an amendment and go through the local law adoption process for that amendment, which will involve community consultation. And that amendment will need to come back to council for their approval to initiate. And we will hopefully have some answers in respect to how that smoke-free objective can be achieved through that local law.
Okay. Look, pleased to see that I guess that we're still on this conversation. I sincerely hope that we can get to a point where we're not creating additional safety risks within our town centres by excluding the roadway from a ban, a smoking ban, and are able to affect a form of words that achieves what the Joint Standing Committee's primary concern seems to be, which is around private vehicles rather than the public realm. Thank you for the clarification.
Seconder was Councillor Loden. Just to speak to the motion.
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, any further comments or questions in relation to this item? Okay, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Declare that carried universally. Yes, thank you. Okay, so tonight I understand that Councillor Opolo wishes to move an item of urgent business. So Councillor Opolo, as part of the meeting procedures local law, you'll need to put that forward and then I need to give you a ruling on that. Would you like to put forward your motion? At what point do we need to go behind closed doors, Executive Manager?
Thank you, Mayor. It would get to the, we'd need to go to behind closed doors if we got to debating a motion or debating whether a motion should be treated as urgent or not. So proposing the motion now and getting your permission doesn't need to go behind closed doors. Should your ruling not be agreed with, then that debate might have to go behind closed doors, given the nature of what it is.
So you'll start the process by putting forward your motion.
So the motion I wanted to table for consideration of council and prior to that, the Mayor's ruling as to whether it qualifies for a matter that is urgent business is reads that council instructs the CEO to defer making any further legally or financially binding operational decisions to progress the implementation of council's resolution of 14 December 2021, item 9.16, proposed lease of Hyde Park kiosk to Veggie Mama Proprietary Limited until after council has considered the motions passed at the annual meeting of electors held on 2 February 2022. The reasons for...
No, we don't outline reasons.
Okay.
No. Okay. So in response, this created a very interesting debate because we haven't had a motion of this nature in some time. So just to sort of walk you through the thinking, first of all, there was discussion about urgent business, and then there was discussion about revoking or changing decisions of council. So in terms of 10.2, it talks about revoking or changing of decisions at a subsequent meeting, and that requires 3 council members when you're looking at the full council, 1/3 of council. So I discussed with the manager of executive governance whether a deferral of a decision made 3 months ago was effectively changing the decision because it does have an impact on timeframe. We sort of weren't sure, so we went to Welga, and Welga has said that it is permissible to defer a council decision without that being revoking or changing. So we clarified that part, so that's fine. So then we go to urgent business, and I understand the intent of the motion because you would like to discuss this at this juncture and not wait for next month. So on that basis, I'm happy to allow the motion to come forward, and if you get a seconder, then we will need to debate that. So I'm satisfied that on the basis that you wish to discuss this at this point, rather than in 4 weeks' time, that I'm comfortable to allow that to happen. So that was where the thinking was this afternoon. So we had to work through a bit of a process, and we did go to Tony Brown at Welga, who is extremely experienced in governance, just to clarify that. Mm-hmm. And Peter was right, because Peter is also an expert. So I just wanted to put that on the record.
Just to provide advice, should Councillor Iopolo wish to move it and see if he has a seconder? Obviously, if he doesn't get a seconder, it will lapse. If he does have a seconder, then perhaps at that point make a decision to go behind closed doors.
Thank you. But we also do have the complication that this again is on subject matter where we will have to take declarations of interest. So do we do that at this point?
Yes, Mayor, that would be a very good idea.
Okay. So we're dealing with Hyde Park and the Hyde Park kiosk decision. We've previously had declarations of interest on this item, so just going to open the floor to council members to make any declarations of interest.
Yeah, Ron Alexander here.
Hi, Ron.
I spoke with David McLennan some time ago and told him I'd done the conflict of interest training and that I wish to withdraw my proximity interest, given the number of people interested in Hyde Park, and what I saw in the conflict of interest training would enable me to do that.
So your argument is that it's an interest in common?
Yes.
Okay, I think we've had this advice, but I'll go back to the executive manager to clarify that an interest in common does not preclude a proximity interest, and the two are treated separately, but perhaps...
No, well, I'm not sure what you're calling an interest in common, but what the conflict of interest training said, that if there was a certain number of people who were interested in the same subject, And because of the bulk of the people with things like turtles and well-being of Hyde Park and all that, that you had the same rights as they had, and therefore
that's defined as an interest in common. So I'll just go to the executive manager to talk about the interplay between interest in common and proximity interest and whether one cancels out the other.
Thank you, Mayor. In short, Councillor Alexander will still have a proximity interest. The question then remains whether Council would be able to permit him the ability to participate in either debate or voting on this particular matter. And the reasons for those, the potential reasons are that the matter is so trivial or insignificant as likely to influence their conduct in relation to the matter, or the matter is held in common to a significant number of electors or ratepayers. I believe when we last dealt with it in December, I did go on and talk about interest in common and the advice that came back from Wolga in respect to interest in common. And Council chose at that time to allow Councillor Alexander to, from memory, participate in the meeting but not vote.
Has there been any change in your view since we last dealt with this?
There's been a change in my view.
I understand that, but I'm seeking advice on the change of your view.
Well, David McLennan assured me that the conflict had finished and was no longer relevant.
Through Mayor Cole, the proximity interest remains while the property that you own adjoins the property in question.
Well, David, if you told me that at that stage, I would have taken it further and investigated myself further with Wolga. You can't tell me 3 or 4 weeks ago that it's now diminished and because I wish to withdraw it and it's finished, and now change your mind.
Through you, Mayor. I think the issue is that the issue has raised its head again, and therefore Council has to consider some issues falling out of it. Notwithstanding that, Mayor, you've asked me whether I think that Councillor Alexander still has an interest. Ultimately, one of the key issues in respect to this is the councillors have to determine whether they have an interest or not, and then if that's their decision. My view is, in considering the issues there, is that I do believe Councillor Alexander has a proximity interest. The legislation is very clear in that respect. It's clumsy legislation, but it is what it is. In respect to an extent of the interest, and if it's an interest in common, I don't actually believe personally that there is an interest in common. Interest in common, I think, would be relevant if it was talking about thousands of properties, but not when you're talking about hundreds.
But it's talking about thousands of people who have an interest in Hyde Park.
So I think from our discussion last time around, the proximity interest and the interest in common is how many people have that same proximity to Hyde Park and what percentage of that your dwelling represents in that context, rather than the interest of people in an issue. And this is the act. This is the act that we have to follow. That's my recollection of the last time we discussed this. It wasn't about interest in the issue itself, but about the number of dwellings that would have a proximity interest.
No, well, I disagree with that. It was about the number of people. That's what I read in the conflict of interest training.
Thank you, Mayor. In this particular instance, I believe it's in respect to a conflict of interest due to proximity.
And what happens in the case where a council member does not wish to make a declaration on an item where they've withdrawn that declaration. So I haven't dealt with that previously.
Thank you, Mayor, nor have I. It would be an issue, I suspect, tested by complaint, investigation, and whatever action falls out of that. So the city has code of conduct. Within the code of conduct is a requirement for council members to declare interest when it's reasonably expected that they have an interest. Failure to do so when there is an interest could lead to a complaint and a consequence. However, that responsibility doesn't fall to council.
So I'm just trying to protect council here. So we have a withdrawal of a declaration of interest which has previously stood on an item. That is the council member's prerogative. So if we proceed on the basis that that's been withdrawn and that's a council member's prerogative, are we exposing council in any way because we've previously considered a proximity interest? Or does the risk wholly reside with Councillor Alexander?
Part of the advice, Mayor, that I used at the last meeting was, and I'll state it, if the remaining members present at the meeting acting in good faith allow a member to participate under the provisions of section 568 of the Act, then that judgment should be capable of withstanding any challenge in the court. So it wouldn't necessarily invalidate council's decision in respect to it if it's done in good faith.
But in that circumstance, we had to make a ruling on a proximity interest. In this case, we've had a withdrawal of an interest. So the scenarios are different. So I just want to make sure that whatever happens from here, that the council members understand what the implications are for us and that Councillor Alexander understands the implications for him. If it's borne entirely by the council member and their requirement to make a declaration, then we can proceed on the basis that there has been no declaration, but I'm not prepared to risk council acting in any way inappropriately, and certainly not myself.
My query is, when I read the conflict of interest, that I have what's in common with other ratepayers. And if there's a significant number of other ratepayers, not necessarily ratepayers with a proximity interest, then I should have the same rights as them. That's how I read it. So what I would like to dispute is that in common with other ratepayers. And you know, Peter might have an opinion. It doesn't necessarily make him right, because what I read in the conflict of interest papers is different to what he's implying. So I'd like to test that with Walger.
Through Mayor Cole, the administration's advice on conflicts of interest in general, rather than the specific cases, if there's any doubt, declare, and always urge on the side of caution of declaring, just to avoid any perception of bias, if there is any doubt as well. It is stricter and much clearer in relation to proximity interests, because it's just a legal definition about whether or not one property adjoins the other. So it would be hard to not recognise, because council already has the proximity interest of a councillor's property adjoining the subject property of the motion.
So what does all that mean?
Through Mayor Cole, Councillor Alexander, we would strongly advise you to declare a proximity interest, given it was.
I'm wanting it to be tested by Walger.
Walger's doors are currently closed and we're trying to deal with an urgent motion. So that's very problematic. But the executive manager of governance is going to go back to the preliminary advice that was given when we first had this issue raised.
Thank you, Mayor. And may I mention that the advice that I provide was checked with Walga when it was provided. So if I can quickly run through. The local government operational guidelines declaring financial interests in meetings provides the following. After disclosing the nature and extent of a council member's interest in a matter to the meeting, the council member may, without further disclosure, request the remaining members present who are entitled to vote to allow the council member during any discussion or decision-making procedure on the relevant matter. So the decision on whether Councillor Alexander participates could happen either at the disclosure interest section or at the time of dealing with the item, which we're currently doing now. After the request is made to participate, the council member must leave the room while the request is put to the meeting and the member decide whether to allow the council member to stay for deliberations on the matter. The remaining members present can allow the council member to participate only if they decide that the interest is either so trivial or insignificant as unlikely to influence their conduct in relation to the matter, or held in common to a significant number of electors or ratepayers. These determinations are based on the extent of the interest. Thus, when considering a member's request to participate, other members must make certain that they are aware of the full extent of the interest of the member making the request. My advice to Councillor Alexander in the original, when he asked for a guidance, was that the Act requires you to disclose a proximity interest that you or a person whom you are closely associated has in a matter before a council or committee meeting. You or a person whom you are closely associated have a proximity interest in any matter that concerns, and in this case I'll be very specific, a proposed development of land that adjoins a person's land. Development refers to the development, maintenance or management of the land or services or facilities on that land. The existence of a proximity interest is established purely by the location of land, a financial effect on the valuation of your land or on the profitability of your business. A financial effect on the valuation of your land or the profitability of your business does not have to be established. So just purely on the location.
Can I just hold you up there? Can you go to the in common with other ratepayers section?
Thank you. It is building the story. So in respect to you, Councillor Alexander, the person's land referred to is both land in which you or a person to whom you are closely associated have an estate or an interest in, and the land that adjoins a person's land is defined by the Act as land that is directly across a thoroughfare from the person's land, which is in this case the circumstances for you. Therefore, clearly a proximity interest does exist. Just because it might be an interest in common or so trivial that it's insignificant doesn't mean that a proximity interest doesn't exist. It does exist and therefore needs to be declared. The question then goes, I note that the guideline further note that the decision on whether to disclose an interest is yours and yours alone. Nobody can direct you to disclose or can disclose it for you. In respect to an interest common to a significant number of electors or ratepayers, the guidelines note that the nature and extent of your interest is no more or less than affecting a significant number of electors or ratepayers of your local government district, then the interest is considered common between them and you, and no disclosure is required. If you wish to use this exemption, you would need to establish the nature and extent of your interest, the number of either electors or ratepayers that have the same interest as you, both nature and extent, and whether that number could be considered significant.
Okay, well, that's the bit that I'm relying on. And that's what I asked David McLennan 3 weeks ago. And he said it was diminished. It wasn't required now.
Can I just ask though, is the point, because this is what I'm trying to understand. If you have a proximity interest, it sounds like it's mutually exclusive of an interest in common. So even if you could say the interest in common was so much that the proximity interest is about where you live in relation to where the decision's being made, And
No,
that
that's-
doesn't work in.
that's not my
I'm just trying to
understanding.
understand if this is the right. From what you just said a moment ago, you said a proximity interest continues even where there is an interest in common. Is that correct? Because I think that's the crux of it.
My understanding was if there was a significant number of ratepayers with an interest in common, you then didn't need to declare a proximity interest.
Thank you through the chair. My understanding is that based on the legislation, proximity interest exists, and then to participate in a decision-making, you'd need to demonstrate to council that it is either one of two things. It's either insignificant in the nature of it, or it's an interest in common to a significant number of electors or ratepayers. That would be my understanding.
Okay, that's very important. Thank you for clarifying that. And then is the interest in common around how many people share that proximity interest, or is the interest in common about the subject matter that you're debating?
My understanding was how many ratepayers are interested in Hyde Park and its well-being, or how many people are interested in what goes on in Hyde Park, which have then a similar interest to me, who's got a proximity interest. I don't have any shares in the What Flip ban or anything else. I can't see any of it from where I reside anyway, so the whole thing is largely pathetic. But I still believe I've got an in common interest with a substantial number of ratepayers. Now, I didn't follow that up any further because David told me it wasn't required. That when I said I wanted to say the proximity interest was really not right, and then I was out of it, he said, well, it doesn't matter anymore. Well, clearly it does. So I'd like the time to go and speak to Walga to sort it out with them, because I do have an interest in common with a lot of ratepayers.
So, Councillor Alexander, are you saying that you're not declaring an interest, and so therefore council doesn't need to consider that this evening?
No, I'm telling you what the situation is, and that it's a bit unfair to call me on it now after I sought some advice on it, got told what I've repeated a couple of times already, and now this comes up.
Well, that was not of my doing, Councillor Alexander. We don't often have urgent items brought forward in this manner, and I'm doing the best I can. Whether you declare an interest or not is your call. I just don't want any exposure to other council members. That's all I'm trying to clarify. I'm not actually that concerned about the participation as we did last time, but I just don't want any breaches against council or any issues of not following the code of conduct for council. And as long as we're clear, and if you're withdrawing your interest and you're bearing the risk, that's okay with me.
Well, I'm not. What I'm saying is, I believe there's an in common, my house is across the road from Hyde Park, but the conflict of interest would say that I have a common interest with a lot of ratepayers.
Well, the situation for me as a presiding member, I have an urgent motion of business to be determined. You're telling me you would like to get Welga's advice, which is not available at this moment. I need to understand from you whether you're declaring an interest or not, so that we can rule on it. If you're not declaring an interest, we don't need to rule on it, and we can proceed and you bear the risk.
I'm declaring my property is across the road from
you. Through you, Mayor Cole, then we can record that as a proximity interest of Councillor Alexander's property being across the road from the subject property of the motion.
And I reserve my right to speak to Walga.
The action is happening now. So whatever you decide now is recorded in the minutes and it is acted upon. You can't reserve whether you've declared or not declared and then seek to address it later. It's a live action that happens now, and your choice is to declare or not declare, and then council can then follow through and do what we need to do.
I get told one thing by the CEO 3 weeks ago, and now it's changed.
But Councillor Alexander, the decision is yours. Are you declaring an interest or not?
I declared my house is across the road.
Well, that's a proximity interest.
You call it what you like. And I have an interest in common with a lot of other ratepayers.
Through the chair, as a consequence of Councillor Alexander declaring a proximity interest, which it is, and I assume from Councillor Alexander is seeking to participate in this, Councillor Alexander would need to leave the meeting for council. He needs to explain the extent that he wishes to participate, whether he wishes to participate in both the debate and vote or just participate in the debate. Councillor Alexander would need to leave the room while that request is considered. If it's not approved, council would advise him of the outcome and continue to deal with the matter. If council decides to allow Councillor Alexander to participate and the extent of his participation, then, and that's voted on, then Councillor Alexander obviously can participate in whatever form that councillors resolved, but that would be the process.
Councillor Alexander, what is your request of council in terms of your participation?
As Peter suggests.
There was actually a choice there. You need to request whether we allow you to vote and participate or participate only.
Okay, well, I'd like to say I don't have any special interest in anything more than anyone else. So I would like to participate in the discussion and the vote.
Thank you very much. We'll just put you in the waiting room while we discuss this. Councillors, we have a motion before us. Councillor Alexander has in effect declared a proximity interest, but would like to vote and participate in the debate on this motion. So I put it to you to seek your views. Moved by Councillor Loden, seconded by Councillor Wallace. Councillor Loden.
Thank you, Mayor. My views unchanged from last time round. I don't see anything that's changed between now and last time round, and that view was I'm happy for Councillor Alexander to participate in the debate, but I'm not comfortable with him voting on the matter because of proximity interest. So that would be the position I would move.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace.
Yeah, that's my view as well. I guess the proximity interest is undeniable. I think there's some confusion about a shared interest around shared interests that we all have as park goers, which isn't a declarable interest, so isn't really up for discussion. Certainly there's not enough property owners adjacent Hyde Park for the proximity interest to be an interest in common. Yeah, having said that, I think it's acceptable to me that Councillor Alexander participates in the debate, but just isn't permitted to vote.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace. Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Also, my position hasn't changed from last time, although my position is different to Councillor Loden and Councillor Wallace. I'm not in favour of Councillor Alexander either participating or voting on the matter. I think it's actually really important that we set a high bar and a good standard in council and in our deliberations, and we don't invite any question of undue influence or improper participation. I think proximity interest is one of the clearest interests that need to be declared. I agree with Councillor Wallace that it is, to my mind, very clear that there is no interest in common here. And so I don't see any basis for allowing any participation whatsoever.
Councillors. Councillor Apollo.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm still not clear, 100% clear whether the obligation is on the person, or not, or whether it's because the Mayor spoke about the implications for the rest of the councillors. So I'm not actually really clear on whether it's the person who the onus is all and the responsibility is all on the person to declare it themselves? Because if it is and there's no implication to the others, then that's up to that person and to defend that position. Yeah, I do sympathise with the situation that to me it does feel like it's one of those things where the interest in common could be at play. I don't know the technical answer, and therefore, you know, if it is up to the person, then that is something that we'll leave it to him. But I'm still not clear whether he actually declared a proximity interest or not.
Councillor Uplow, we've taken it that he has because he said he declares that he owns property adjacent to the park.
Okay.
And that is pretty much the definition of a proximity interest.
Okay.
We wouldn't be having this debate if he hadn't declared an interest. So what is your position?
Probably that that he should be able to participate in the discussion, but not vote.
Thank you, councillors. Councillor Hallett.
Thank you. Yeah, my perspective hasn't changed. I think proximity interests are pretty clear. I'm a bit gobsmacked that we're spending this amount of time talking about nuance of a proximity interest when I think it's pretty clear that it removes participation at all.
Councillor Warner, do you wish to speak to it?
I think Councillor Hallett summed it up beautifully just then. So, yeah, there's no confusion with me here. I think we need to, there's a proximity interest issue and we need to abide by what that means.
As the last speaker, thank you very much all for your comments. And I know that last time we considered this and allowed debate. I have to be frank and say that debate was deeply uncomfortable for me. And I think it was clear that that proximity interest did influence Councillor Alexander's views on the issue. And I felt very uncomfortable and I don't feel that I should have to put myself in that position again. Proximity interests are extremely clear, as Councillor Castle has said. There's no black and white on a proximity interest. And so based on previous experience in December, on this occasion, I will vote against voting and participation, this being a very clear and unequivocal proximity interest. Councillor Gontaszewski, have you spoken on this?
No, I haven't. I think in general terms, I think there's a clear difference between interests, like I have interests like doing this and doing that, and an interest in this term. So I think I do have some sympathy for Councillor Alexander in that he felt as though he received some advice and that this urgent motion has meant that the issue has raised its head again and he felt that he had heard one thing. So I guess on that grounds, I think it's reasonable to allow him to participate in the debate, definitely not to vote. And I think that should this matter be considered in future, that I would reserve my right to change my position and would expect that out of session there is some clear clarification on this, and that I trust that Councillor Alexander has heard the advice that's been given to him by administration today and the views of council members, and that ultimately, you know, I don't believe that I would be voting this way in future. I think that the message is quite clear.
Through Mayor Cole, I'm trying to recall the exact conversation I had with Councillor Alexander, but he did indicate that he wanted to withdraw his conflict of interest, which he declared in December. And my advice was that's after the fact it was declared, and then there was a discussion on a council, a debate on it. I didn't actually know what the mechanism for doing that would be, other than potentially amending the minutes, which had already been adopted for that meeting in December, or asking council to rescind their previous vote on that matter as well. But I thought the matter was behind council and behind Councillor Alexander after the decision in December, so I didn't know it would be being discussed at length tonight.
Okay, everyone has now spoken, so I'll put the motion. All those in favour of allowing Councillor Alexander to participate in the vote, please raise your hands. Sorry, I'll start again. We're clear from the debate that no one is in support of allowing participation through voting. So we'll just deal with the motion of participation in debate. So all those in favour of allowing Councillor Iopolo, who has declared a proximity interest, to participate in debate. Oh, I'm so sorry, Councillor Alexander, to participate in debate on this urgent motion, please raise your hands. That's 3. All those against? That's 5. So there will be no participation or voting in this issue where Councillor Alexander has a proximity interest. Okay, now I do need a motion to go behind closed doors to, oh, sorry, no, we do have a motion. We have dealt with interests. I now need to call for a seconder to see if this motion has status to be debated. So is there a seconder for this motion? Seconded by Councillor Wallace. So now I'll ask for a mover and seconder to go behind closed doors so that we can consider this motion in confidential session due to the, can we just be clear on that, on the reasons for confidentiality that it's considering?
Sorry, Mayor, it's considering several things. It's considering considering the motion to defer the implementation of the decision from December or any further implementation. It impacts on the personal affairs of the lessor. It impacts on potential contractual and legal issues. And during that, there may be a request to consider some legal issues that the city has been subject to.
Okay. All right. On the basis of that advice, I'll get a mover and seconder to move behind closed doors. Moved by Councillor Iopolo, seconded by Councillor Castle. All those in favour? I declare that carried. We'll just wait for the live stream to pause.